It was a large room with big windows overlooking the backyard, and that's where he had his desk, his computer, and all his office equipment. What I remember most about that room was the electric pencil sharpener he kept on a small side table next to the window. It was one of those old, heavy, beige-colored sharpeners that made a very specific sound when you used it, a mechanical hum followed by a click when it finished sharpening the pencil. My dad used it constantly because he was always doing calculations by hand, drawing plans, taking notes. The sound of that sharpener was part of the soundtrack of our house. That Tuesday morning was a normal school day. My dad drove my sister and me to school like always, and my mom stayed home to finish getting ready before going to work. It was a routine we had followed for years, nothing out of the ordinary. My mom later told me what happened after she was alone in the house. It was around 8:15 in the morning when she heard the pencil sharpener turn on upstairs in my dad's study. At first, she didn't pay much attention to it because it was such a familiar sound that it was practically part of the background noise of the house. But then she realized something was strange. The sharpener was being used over and over again without stopping. Buzz, click, pause, buzz, click, pause, buzz, click. It was as if someone was sharpening pencil after pencil after pencil, with great patience, taking their time to make each one perfect. My mom continued with her morning routine, but the sound kept going and going and going. After about 5 minutes of listening to that constant noise, she started to feel nervous. My dad had already left the house, and so had we. There was no one else there, yet someone was using the pencil sharpener in the study on the second floor. She stopped what she was doing and listened more carefully. The sound was definitely coming from my dad's study. There was no doubt about it. It was exactly the noise his electric sharpener made, that mechanical hum followed by the final click that meant the pencil was ready. But there was something about the rhythm that made her deeply uneasy. It wasn't the random way someone normally uses a sharpener when they need a pencil. It was methodical, steady, as if someone had decided to sharpen a specific number of pencils and was systematically working through a pile. My mom shouted from the first floor, "Is anyone up there?" The sound stopped immediately. Total silence. She waited a few seconds and shouted again, "Hello?" Nothing. But a few seconds later, the sharpener turned on again. Buzz, click, pause, buzz, click. That was when my mom really panicked. She grabbed her purse, ran out of the house, and drove straight to the police station about 10 minutes away. The officer who helped her probably thought she was overreacting, but when my mom explained the situation, the type of house we had, with all its hallways and doors, and the fact that someone could have easily gotten in without her noticing, he decided to send someone to check it out. 2 police officers went to the house with my mom. They checked every room, every closet, every space where someone could have hidden. They opened all the doors, looked under every bed, checked the basement, the attic, even the access spaces behind the walls. They didn't find anyone, but when they reached my dad's study, they found something that left them confused. The study closet, which was normally locked and that we never used for anything, was completely open. The door was wide open, as if someone had opened it on purpose. And on top of my dad's desk, perfectly aligned in a straight row, were 12 freshly sharpened pencils. They weren't the pencils my dad normally used. They were brand new pencils, the most basic kind you can buy at any store. All identical, all sharpened to perfection. Tips so symmetrical and precise, they looked machine-made. The officers asked if my dad could have left those pencils there before leaving that morning. She told them definitely not. My dad was rushing like crazy that morning because we were running late, and besides, those weren't his pencils. He always used mechanical pencils. He almost never used wooden ones. One of the officers checked the sharpener. It was plugged in like always, and when he turned it on to test it, it worked perfectly. He sharpened a test pencil, and the sound was exactly what my mom had been hearing. The police didn't know what to say. It was obvious that someone had been in the house, had opened the study closet, had sharpened 12 pencils using my dad's sharpener, and then had disappeared without leaving a trace. But how did that person get in? And more importantly, how did they leave without my mom seeing them? It was a complete mystery. Our house had 4 different entrances: the front door, the back door that led to the yard, a side door that led to the garage, and a basement door that opened to the side garden. Any of those doors could have been used to get in and out, but my mom was on the ground floor all morning, moving between the kitchen, the living room, and her bathroom. From any of those places, she would have seen or heard someone using the main doors. The house was old, and all the doors made noise when they were opened. The only explanation the police could come up with was that someone had been hiding in the house before my dad left that morning. They had waited for the house to be relatively quiet, done their strange work with the pencils, and then escaped through one of the doors my mom couldn't see directly. But that didn't make much sense either. Why would someone risk breaking into an occupied house just to sharpen pencils? When we got home from school that afternoon, my mom told us everything that had happened. She showed us the 12 pencils still perfectly lined up on my dad's desk. It was incredibly unsettling to see them there, all identical, all perfect, knowing that someone had entered our home just to put them there. That night, my dad searched the entire house, looking for signs of forced entry, broken windows, damaged locks. He found nothing. All the doors and windows were intact. All the locks worked perfectly. But the next day, we found something else. When my mom went to her car to go to work, she found a perfectly sharpened pencil on the passenger seat. It was identical to the 12 pencils that had appeared on my dad's desk, the same brand, the same type, sharpened with the same precision. The car had been locked all night, parked inside our closed garage. There was no way someone could have gotten into the car without breaking something or having a key. That was when we realized we weren't dealing with a normal break-in or someone who had wandered into the house by accident. We were dealing with someone sending us a message, someone who wanted us to know they could reach us whenever they wanted, wherever they wanted. The following days were tense. Every time we heard any strange noise in the house, we all got nervous. Every time something was out of place, we wondered whether one of us had moved it or if it had been our mysterious visitor. My dad installed new locks on all the doors and put security bars on all the first-floor windows. He even installed a basic alarm that would go off if a door or window was opened at night. But none of that made us feel truly safe, because we knew that whoever did this had found a way in that we couldn't detect or prevent.
Hey, Shun. During all that time, my mom kept sleeping deeply. Her soft snores continued uninterrupted, as if nothing unusual were happening less than 2 meters away from her. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared. It didn't walk away. It didn't fade gradually. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, and it had simply vanished. The moment it disappeared, I was able to move again. My muscles relaxed, my breathing returned to normal, and I suddenly realized I had been sweating cold the entire time. I stayed awake the rest of the night. There was no way I could go back to sleep after what had happened. I lay in bed, staring at the spot where the figure had been, waiting for it to reappear, but nothing else happened. When morning came and my mom woke up, I tried to tell her what I had seen. I described the figure, the voice, the feeling of terror I had experienced, but I could see on her face that she thought it had been a dream, or perhaps a hallucination caused by travel fatigue. "It was probably your imagination," she said. "You were very tired last night, and sometimes when we're in a new place, our brain can play strange tricks on us." I knew it wasn't my imagination. I knew the difference between dreaming and being awake, and I had definitely been awake the entire time during that encounter. But I also understood why my mom didn't believe me. It was the kind of story that sounds made up, the kind of experience impossible to prove. The following days in Cape Cod were strange. During the day, everything seemed normal. We went to the beach, walked around town, ate at local restaurants. But at night, when it was time to sleep, I became incredibly anxious. I tried sleeping face down toward the wall so I wouldn't have to look at the rest of the room, but that didn't help much because I could feel when something was different in the atmosphere, even if I wasn't seeing it. The second night, nothing happened. I stayed awake for hours waiting for the figure to appear again, but the room remained normal the entire night. The third night, however, was different. I woke up at exactly 3 a.m., fully alert for no apparent reason. It's strange how sometimes your body knows something is wrong before your conscious mind realizes it. I opened my eyes and immediately knew I wasn't alone in the room. This time, I didn't see the figure right away, but I could hear very soft footsteps, as if someone were walking barefoot around the room, trying not to make any noise. The steps were slow and deliberate, as if the person were exploring the space, familiarizing themselves with the arrangement of the furniture. My mom was still sleeping deeply, snoring lightly as usual, but the steps continued, moving around the room in a pattern I couldn't understand. After a few minutes, the steps stopped. The room was completely silent, except for my mom's breathing, but I knew there was still something there. I could feel its presence, that impossible-to-ignore sensation of being watched. I lay there with my eyes closed, pretending to be asleep, hoping whatever was in the room would leave. But after a while, curiosity overpowered fear, and I very slowly opened one eye to look. The figure was there again, standing in the same spot as the first night, but this time closer to my bed, close enough that I could make out more details. It was definitely a woman, wearing what looked like a long dress or robe. Her hair was dark and long, framing her face in a way that made it impossible to see her features clearly. But there was something about the shape of her head, the way it tilted slightly to one side, that felt both familiar and completely strange. This time, when she spoke, her voice was different, clearer, more present, as if she had found a way to make her voice more solid, more real. "Hey, Ash," she whispered again, but then added something else, something I couldn't fully understand. It sounded like words, but not in any language I recognized. Or maybe it was English words so distorted I couldn't process them correctly. This time, the figure stayed longer. She stood there, speaking in whispers I couldn't understand for what seemed like hours, and during all that time, I couldn't move, couldn't respond. I could only lie there, fully conscious, but completely helpless. The next morning, my family noticed I looked terrible. I had deep, dark circles under my eyes, was pale, and clearly hadn't slept at all. My uncle asked if I felt sick, if I needed to see a doctor. I tried to explain what was happening, but I could see they thought I was having some kind of nervous breakdown. My grandfather suggested that maybe school stress was affecting me, that perhaps I needed to talk to a counselor when we got home. That was our last night in Cape Cod. During the day, I did everything I could to stay awake, thinking that maybe if I was tired enough,
I could sleep deeply and not wake if the figure appeared again, but it didn't work. At 3 a.m., like clockwork, I woke up again. This time, the figure was already there when I opened my eyes, as if it had been waiting for me to wake up. For the first time, I could see her face clearly. It was not a normal human face. It was as if someone had taken a person's features and slightly stretched or distorted them. Her eyes were too big, her mouth too wide, and there was something about her facial structure that looked off. But the most disturbing thing was that despite the distortion, she seemed familiar. It was like someone I knew, but subtly, fundamentally altered. She looked me directly in the eyes and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It showed too many teeth, stretched too far across her face, and then she spoke to me more clearly than ever before. "I know you're awake," she said. Her voice was no longer a whisper. It was clear and audible, though it still had that strange quality, as if coming from far away. "I know you can see me, and I know you're afraid, but you don't have to be. I just came to meet you." I tried to ask her what she wanted, who she was, why she was there, but no sound came from my mouth. It was as if my vocal cords had disconnected from my brain. "We'll see each other again," she said, that horrible smile still on her face, and then she disappeared, exactly as the previous times. We returned home the next day, and I haven't seen the figure since, but I know it's still out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to fulfill its promise that we will see each other again. Every night when I go to bed, I wonder if tonight will be the night it comes back. And every morning when I wake up and realize it didn't come, I don't know whether to feel relieved or more scared than before, because I know it will eventually keep its word. And when it does, this time we will really be able to talk. Story. I grew up in the suburbs of Charlotte, in one of those 70s houses that feel like mazes. It was huge, with hallways connecting in strange ways, 2 flights of stairs, and more doors than any normal house should have. My dad always said he got a bargain when he bought it, but I think now I understand why it was so cheap. The house had 3 floors, including the basement, and the second floor was where my dad's study was.
It was a mix of confusion, fear, and something else I couldn't identify at the time, but which I now recognize as the feeling of having seen something that shouldn't exist. My mom asked him what he had found, and he described the footprints. He said they were unlike anything he had ever seen, and that he had no idea what kind of animal or person could have made them. He also told her that he hadn't found anything else. There were no broken branches, no other signs that something had passed through the forest. That night, I slept in my parents' room. There was no way I was going to stay alone in my bedroom after what I had seen. My dad put a loaded rifle next to the bed and kept the yard lights on all night. By morning, everything seemed normal again. It was Christmas. There were presents to open, and the house felt cheerful and safe in the daylight. But when we went out into the yard to look at the footprints again, they were still there, perfectly preserved in the snow. My dad measured them again, photographed them, and even called some of his hunter friends to come take a look. None of them could explain what had made them. They said they didn't resemble the tracks of any animal they knew, and definitely weren't from a normal person. Over the next few days, my dad did more research. He talked to neighbors, called the fish and game department, and even contacted a biologist at the local university. No one could give him a satisfactory explanation. But what disturbed me the most, and what still disturbs me to this day, was something I discovered years later. When I was 16, I was cleaning out the attic and found an old journal my dad had kept during my early years. I was reading it out of curiosity when I reached the entries from December of that year. I had been having the same dream for 2 years before that Christmas Eve. In the dream,
I was standing at my window, looking out into the yard, when I saw a huge shadow approaching the house. It was always exactly the same. The shadow had horns or branches on its head. It was bigger than any normal person and stopped directly beneath my window. I had had that dream so many times that I had started drawing it. My dad had kept some of those drawings in the journal, and when I saw them, I got goosebumps. They were exactly the same as what I had seen that Christmas Eve, down to the last detail. I had been dreaming about that thing for 2 years before it actually appeared. I don't know how to explain that. I don't know if I somehow knew it was going to happen, or if dreaming about it somehow made it real, or if there's something stranger going on that I don't understand. What I do know is that after that night, I never had that dream again, and we never saw strange footprints in our yard or giant shadows at my window again. But every Christmas Eve, when I see the snow falling and hear that special silence that Christmas night has, I remember those footsteps approaching the house, that enormous shadow filling my window, and the absolute certainty I felt that night that there was something out there that shouldn't exist. And I wonder if it's still out there in the forest, waiting for the next Christmas Eve to walk through the snow to the window of some 7-year-old child who has been dreaming about it for years without knowing it. Story 8. This happened just a few weeks ago, and I still can't sleep well. We went to Cape Cod for a family vacation, something we had been planning for months. It was me, my mom, my grandfather, and my uncle. We had rented this small little cottage from the 1960s, one of those typical coastal buildings that seem like they've always been there. The house was tiny. It only had 2 microscopic bedrooms, and we ended up sleeping very close together. My mom and I shared a room where 2 twin beds barely fit side by side, with maybe half a meter between them. My grandfather and my uncle were in the next room, which was just as small. We arrived late that night after driving for hours. It was around 3:30 in the morning when we finally settled in and turned off the lights. I was exhausted from the trip, but it was that kind of nervous exhaustion that sometimes keeps you awake even when your body is screaming for sleep. I lay in my bed facing my mom's bed. The room was almost completely dark. There was a small night lamp giving off a very dim light, that weak yellowish glow old lamps have. It was enough to see the outlines of the furniture, but not much more than that. My mom fell asleep almost immediately. I could hear her breathing in that deep, steady way that tells you someone is truly asleep. I, on the other hand, stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the next day, about the things we were going to do at the beach, trying to calm my mind so I could fall asleep. About half an hour must have passed when I felt myself finally drifting off. My eyelids were getting heavy, and that floating sensation you get just before losing consciousness was starting. But I wasn't fully asleep yet. I was in that in-between state, halfway between awake and asleep. I blinked, one of those long blinks you make when you're about to fall asleep. And when I opened my eyes, there was a figure standing directly in front of me. It was the silhouette of a woman, completely black against the dim light of the lamp. She had long hair falling over her shoulders and down her back, and she was standing so close to my bed that I could have touched her if I had stretched out my arm. She was looking straight at me, though I couldn't see her features clearly in the darkness. My first thought was that it was my mom. Maybe she had gotten up to go to the bathroom or check on something and had stopped by my bed to see if I was okay. That would have been normal. That was the kind of thing my mom would do. But something was wrong. My mom was in her bed, softly snoring. I could hear her clearly. I could see her shape under the blankets, completely motionless in the position she had fallen asleep in. It took my brain a few seconds to process what that meant. If my mom was in her bed asleep, then the figure standing next to me couldn't be her. It felt like ice-cold water had been poured on my entire body.
My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and suddenly I was completely awake, every nerve in my body on high alert. The figure didn't move. She just stood there, motionless, staring at me. I could feel her presence with an intensity that was almost physical, as if the air around her were denser or colder than the rest of the room. I tried to focus my eyes to see her features more clearly, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make out any details. It was as if she was made of pure shadow, a silhouette cut out against the weak light of the lamp. But she definitely had a human shape. She was definitely a woman, and she was definitely looking at me. And then she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, so quiet that at first I thought I might have imagined it. But then she said it again, more clearly this time, and I definitely heard her. "Hey, shh." That's what she said. Not full words, not a sentence, just, "Hey, shh," as if she were greeting me and telling me to be quiet at the same time. Her voice had a strange quality to it. It didn't sound threatening excellent, but it didn't sound normal either. It was as if she came from very far away, or as if she were speaking from inside a tunnel. It had a subtle echo that shouldn't have been there in such a small room. I was completely paralyzed. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe. It was as if my entire body had decided that the best survival strategy was to remain perfectly still until whatever was happening was over. The figure stayed there for what felt like hours, though it probably was only a few minutes. She made no other sound. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching me, occasionally repeating that same whisper.
It was our first Christmas Eve in that house, and I was super excited. I had helped my mom decorate the tree. We had put lights in all the windows, and the house felt magical with all that Christmas atmosphere. My parents had let me stay up a little later than usual because it was a special night. But when the clock struck 11, my mom insisted that I go to bed. My room was on the second floor, and my window overlooked the backyard. During the first few weeks after we moved, I loved staying by that window, especially at night, because I could see the entire yard illuminated by the moon. It was like having my own private view of nature. That night, I had a hard time falling asleep. It was that typical Christmas Eve excitement when you know the next morning is going to be special and your brain can't stop thinking about the presents and all the fun that's coming. I stayed awake, tossing and turning in bed, checking the clock every few minutes, waiting for it to reach 12 so that it would technically be Christmas. It must have been around 11:30 when I heard the first sound. It was like the sound of someone walking in the snow. You know, that crunch that snow makes when someone steps on it. At first, I thought it was my dad going out to check something in the yard, maybe the Christmas lights or something. But there was something off about the rhythm of those steps. The steps were slow, too deliberate, like the person was walking very carefully or trying to be stealthy, but not quite succeeding. And there was something in the sound that made me uneasy, though I couldn't explain exactly what it was. I got out of bed and went to the window to see what was happening. The yard was fully illuminated by the full moon. It had snowed all day, and everything looked perfect and white, like a Christmas postcard. I could see our snowman we had made that afternoon, the swing my dad had hung from the big oak tree, all covered in a perfect layer of fresh snow. The steps kept getting closer, and I could track exactly where they were coming from by the sound. They were coming from the woods, straight toward the house, following a straight line across the yard. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anyone walking. That was the first thing that really made me nervous. I could hear the steps clearly, each individual crunch of snow being crushed, but there was no one visible in the yard. It was as if someone invisible was walking right toward my window. The steps stopped right below my window. I stood there, looking down, my heart starting to pound faster. There was nothing to see, but I knew something was there. I could feel it. It was that feeling you get when someone is watching you, multiplied by 1,000. And then I saw the shadow. It started small, just below my window, but then it began to grow. It wasn't a normal shadow, like the kind a person casts when standing under a light. This shadow stretched across the entire wall of the house, climbing up to my window and beyond. It was huge, much larger than a normal person could cast. But the scariest part was the shape of the shadow. It had the basic silhouette of a person, but with something extra on its head. 2 protrusions stretching upward, like horns or maybe branches. The shadow was so big it filled my entire window and kept growing. I stood completely frozen, staring at that gigantic shadow projected on my window. It was as if something enormous was standing right below me, something so tall its shadow could reach the 2nd floor of the house. And then I felt something I had never felt before in my life. It was like a cold that didn't come from the air, but from inside me. It started in my stomach and spread throughout my body, reaching my fingers and toes. It was as if my body had understood something my mind hadn't fully processed yet. It was the sensation of pure danger. Not the kind of fear you feel when watching a horror movie or when someone jumps out to scare you. It was deeper, more primal. The kind of fear animals feel when they know a predator is nearby. The kind of fear that tells you that if you don't act immediately, something very bad is going to happen. But at the same time, I couldn't move. It was as if the cold had completely frozen me. My legs wouldn't obey, my arms hung at my sides, and all I could do was stand there, staring at that enormous shadow filling my window. The shadow stayed there for what seemed like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. It didn't move, didn't change shape. It was just there, projecting on my window like it was painted on the glass. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it began to fade. It didn't move to the side or shrink gradually. It simply vanished like smoke dispersing into the air. In seconds, it was completely gone, leaving my window clear again. The moment the shadow disappeared, I could move again. My first instinct was to scream, not a normal scream, but a scream of pure terror from the depths of my lungs. It was so loud they probably heard it throughout the house. My parents came running to my room within seconds. My mom arrived first, immediately followed by my dad. I was completely hysterical, crying and shaking, trying to explain what I had seen, but the words came out all jumbled and confused. My dad hugged me, and I tried to tell him about the footsteps in the snow, the giant shadow with horns, the sense of danger I had felt. But the more I spoke, the more I realized how crazy it all sounded. My dad told me to stay with my mom while he went out to check what had happened. He grabbed his rifle from the hallway closet. My dad had been a hunter since he was young and served in the military, but when I saw him grab that rifle, I knew he was scared too. There was something in the way he held it, as if he really expected to have to use it. My mom and I stayed by the window, looking down as my dad stepped into the backyard with a flashlight. We could see the light moving across the yard, checking every corner, every tree, every place someone could hide. But what he found in the snow is what truly left us speechless. There were footprints, huge footprints, going from the edge of the woods, crossing the entire yard, ending exactly below my window. But they weren't normal human footprints. They were too big, too deep, and had a strange shape unlike any shoe or boot I had ever seen. The most disturbing thing was that the footprints go in only one direction. They ended below my window, and that was it. No return prints, no signs that whatever made them had walked away. It was as if something had reached my window and then vanished into thin air. My dad followed the footprints from the woods to the house, measuring each one with his hands.
They were at least twice as big as his feet, and he wore size 10. Also, they were sunk into the snow far deeper than a normal person's steps should be, as if whatever made them weighed an incredible amount. When my dad returned to the house, he was pale. I had never seen that expression on his face before or since that night.
It was something more primitive, more instinctive. It was that feeling that someone is watching you, but so intense that the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I slowly turned around, and there it was, the same black figure, exactly the same as 8 years earlier, was standing between me and the staircase, completely motionless, without features, without details, just that human shape made of absolute darkness. I dropped my paint palette. The sound of the plastic hitting the concrete floor echoed throughout. It was something more primitive, more instinctive. It was that feeling that someone is watching you, but so intense that the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I slowly turned around, and there it was, the same black figure, exactly the same as 8 years earlier, was standing between me and the staircase, completely motionless, without features, without details, just that human shape made of absolute darkness. I dropped my paint palette. The sound of the plastic hitting the concrete floor echoed throughout the basement, but the figure didn't move at all. This time I could see it more clearly because it was closer. It definitely had the shape of a tall person, but there was something about its proportions that wasn't right. It was too thin, too stretched, as if someone had taken the silhouette of a normal person and elongated it. And again, even though I couldn't see eyes or a face, I knew with absolute certainty that it was staring directly at me. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few seconds. Then my legs took over and I ran toward the stairs. I had to pass right next to that thing to reach the steps, and I swear I felt something like cold as I went by. I ran up the stairs 3 at a time, tripping, falling, getting back up, and continuing. When I reached the top, I screamed to my grandparents that there was something in the basement. My grandfather went down with a flashlight to check, but he found nothing. It was probably just a strange shadow caused by the lights, they told me, but I knew it hadn't been that. And that was when it started appearing in other places. The next time was in the cat's litter box in the garage. I was cleaning the litter when I looked up and saw it standing in the darkest corner of the garage, completely still, watching me. Then it appeared in the school art room. I was staying after classes to finish a project when I felt that same sensation of being watched. I looked toward the door, and there it was, standing in the doorway, partially blocking the entrance. It always appeared at a distance, always in poorly lit places, always completely motionless, and always watching me, even though it had no visible face. The worst part was that no one else ever saw it. It was never standing right there, as clear as any real person, but if someone else was with me, that person never noticed it. It was as if it existed only for me. I started to think I was losing my mind. Maybe I had some kind of mental problem. Maybe I was seeing things that weren't there. But there was something about the way it appeared that felt too real, too consistent to be a hallucination. One day, years later, I was talking on the phone with Caitlin. We didn't see each other much anymore because she had moved to another city, but from time to time we called to catch up. We were talking about random things, school, mutual friends, when suddenly I decided to ask her something I had wanted to ask for years, but had never dared to ask. Do you remember that time when we were little, when we were playing in the snow and saw something strange? I asked, trying to sound casual.
She went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you mean that thing on the woodpile?" My heart stopped. I hadn't given her any details. I hadn't said where or what, but she remembered exactly. "Yes," I said. "Did you really see it?" "Of course I saw it. It was that black thing standing on top of the branches, right? Like a person, but not a person." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. For all those years, I had thought maybe Caitlin had imagined it too, or maybe I had influenced her into thinking she'd seen something. But she remembered it with the exact same details I did. "Have you seen it again?" I asked. "No," she said. "That was the only time. But sometimes I think about it. It's strange. I never completely forget it." That was when I knew for certain that I wasn't crazy. That thing was real, or at least as real as something can be when two people see it exactly the same way. But I also realized something even more disturbing. Caitlin hadn't seen it again, but I had. Why me and not her? What was it about me that made it keep appearing? We moved houses when I was 16. My parents found work in another city, and I thought maybe the change of location would make the appearances stop. Maybe that thing was connected to our old house, to that specific place. The first night in the new house, I went down to the basement to unpack some boxes. It was smaller than my grandparents' basement, with lower ceilings and less light. There was a single bulb hanging from the center of the ceiling, casting strange shadows into every corner. I was taking books out of a box when I felt that familiar sensation, that presence I now recognized immediately. I slowly looked up, already knowing what I was going to see. There it was, in the darkest corner of the basement, exactly the same as always. The same tall, black, featureless figure, completely motionless, as if it had been waiting for me. And that was when I understood something that terrified me more than all the previous appearances combined. It didn't matter where I went, that thing was going to follow me. It wasn't connected to a place, it was connected to me. Years have passed since then, and it still appears. Not very often, maybe once every few months, but always in the same way. Always in poorly lit places, always at a distance, always watching me. I've seen it in empty parking lots at night, standing between the cars. I've seen it in parks, standing beneath the trees. I've seen it in my office after hours when I stay late working. It never comes any closer than necessary. It never tries to touch me or hurt me. It just appears, watches me for a moment, and then disappears when I turn away or blink. Sometimes I think maybe it's some kind of guardian, something protecting me without me knowing it. Other times I think it's something more sinister, something waiting for the perfect moment for something I don't want to imagine. But what disturbs me the most is the persistence. More than 20 years have passed since the first time I saw it, and it's still there, waiting in the shadows, watching me, reminding me that there are things in this world we don't understand. I saw it again last week. I was walking to my car after work. It was late, and the parking lot was almost empty. I felt that familiar sensation, and when I looked back, there it was, standing next to one of the light posts that wasn't working. This time was different, because for the first time in all these years, I raised my hand and waved at it. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was tired of being afraid. Maybe I wanted to see if it would respond in some way. It didn't move, but I swear I felt it acknowledge me, as if it had been waiting all these years for me to finally pay attention instead of just running away. After a few seconds, it disappeared as always, but something had changed. For the first time, I didn't feel fear when I saw it. I felt something more like familiarity. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it's good or bad that we're now communicating.
All I know is that after more than 20 years, that black figure remains a constant part of my life. And for the first time, I wonder if maybe I'm no longer the one being watched. Maybe now we're two strange beings watching each other, trying to understand what we mean to each other in a world far more mysterious than either of us can comprehend.
I stayed awake all night thinking about those precise cuts, about that damp stain on my carpet, about the fact that someone had been in my room, touching my things, cutting my bags while we were upstairs, completely unaware of what was happening. What terrified me the most was thinking about how vulnerable I had been. If someone could enter once without us hearing them, what would stop them from doing it again? And next time, what would they do? Just cut bags again? Or something worse? The next day, I woke up early and went down to my room to look for clean clothes. I entered very carefully, checking every corner before fully stepping in. Everything seemed normal, nothing out of place. But when I went to make my bed, I found something that made me feel as if someone had poured ice-cold water over me. Under my pillow, wrapped in a small plastic bag, was the piece of strap that had been cut from one of my bags. It wasn't just any piece, it was specifically the part of the strap with the bag's brand logo, cut with the same precision as the other cuts and carefully wrapped in clear plastic as if it were a gift or a keepsake. I stood there holding that little plastic bag, unable to believe what I was seeing. Someone had not only been in my room cutting my bags, but had come back during the night while we were upstairs and left this under my pillow. I screamed. I couldn't help it. It was an automatic scream of pure terror. My roommate came running, and when I showed her what I had found, she turned as pale as I did. We called the police again. This time they came faster and brought someone from the investigations department. They took photos of the strap piece, the plastic bag, my bed, my entire room. What worried them most was that someone had returned without us hearing them. They checked all the windows, all the doors, looking for signs that someone had forced entry. They found nothing. The investigator asked me if there was any way someone could have a key to the house. I told him no, that only we had keys and had never given them to anyone else. He also asked if I knew anyone who had master keys or knew how to pick locks. I couldn't think of anyone. I live a pretty normal life. I work in an office. I have normal friends. I don't get into trouble. There's no reason for anyone to want to scare me like this. But the most disturbing thing of all was how personal it felt. It wasn't a random robbery. It wasn't casual vandalism. It was something directed specifically at me, something meant to make me feel vulnerable and scared. And it worked. Since that day, I haven't been able to relax in my own home. Every noise I hear makes me nervous. Every time I go out, I check my room when I return to see if anything has changed. I've installed additional locks on all the windows, and we've changed the locks on all the doors. But none of that makes me feel truly safe, because I know someone managed to enter twice without leaving a trace of how they did it. And if they could do it twice, they can do it again. What terrifies me the most is thinking about the person who did this, someone who took the time to cut my bags so precisely, who stayed long enough to leave a damp stain on my carpet, who came back that same night to leave that piece of strap under my pillow as some kind of message. What kind of person does something like that? And what were they trying to tell me with that message? Sometimes I think maybe it was someone who has been watching me, who knows my routines, who knows when I'm home and when I'm not. Maybe someone who has been planning this for weeks or months. The police say they will keep investigating, but they don't have many leads. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no physical evidence beyond the cut bags and that strap piece. Meanwhile, I keep living in this house,
knowing someone has been in my most intimate space, touching my things, leaving messages under my pillow. Someone who can enter whenever they want, do whatever they want, and leave without a trace. Every night before going to bed, I check under my pillow. So far, I haven't found anything else, but I know that person is still out there, waiting for the perfect moment to remind me again that they can reach me whenever they want. And the scariest part of all is that I still don't know what they really want from me. Story 6. I was 6 years old when I first saw her, and to this day, I can't get that image out of my head. We lived in the country, in one of those houses where the backyard connects directly to miles of forest. It was winter, and it had snowed so much that we had spent days stacking dry branches to make a big fire. Our woodpile easily reached 2 meters high. I was playing outside with Caitlin, my friend from the house next door. It was cold, but not so cold that we couldn't play in the snow. We were dragging an old sled we had found in the garage, laughing and throwing snowballs at each other. It was one of those perfect winter days when the snow is fresh and everything looks clean and bright. We had been playing for about an hour when Caitlin suddenly stopped. She was staring at our woodpile with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't just surprise, it was something deeper. It was pure fear. "Do you see that?" she whispered, without taking her eyes off the pile. I followed her gaze, and what I saw made me feel as if someone had poured cold water into my stomach. There was a figure standing on top of our woodpile, not beside it, not leaning on it, but literally standing on top of it, as if it were solid. It was completely black, so black it seemed to absorb the light around it. It had the shape of a person, but taller than normal. If our pile was 2 meters, this thing must have been at least 2.5 meters. It had no features, no face, no clothes, no details of any kind. It was as if someone had cut the shape of a person out of absolute nothingness and placed it there standing. It was solid, yet at the same time seemed made of pure darkness. We stood there looking up, and that thing was looking back at us. I couldn't see eyes, but I knew it was watching us. It was that feeling you get when someone is observing you, but multiplied 1,000 times. Caitlin grabbed my arm so hard it hurt, but I didn't even notice at the time. I was completely focused on that black figure that shouldn't have existed. And then, without any warning, it disappeared. It didn't move, it didn't fall, it didn't hide behind anything. It just vanished into thin air as if it had never been there. We ran screaming to my house. My parents came out to see what was happening, but when we tried to explain what we had seen, it seemed like they thought it was our imagination. "They're just kids playing," my mom said. "They probably saw a weird shadow or something." But I knew what I had seen, and Caitlin did too. Years passed, and although I never forgot that black figure, I began to think maybe my parents were right. Maybe it had been my childish imagination. Maybe it was just a strange shadow caused by the clouds or something. By the time I was 14, I was almost convinced it wasn't real. Until I saw it again. I was in my grandparents' basement painting. My grandparents had this huge basement they had turned into a sort of art studio for me. It had good light, lots of space, and I could make as much noise as I wanted without bothering anyone. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had been painting for hours. I had music on and was completely focused on what I was doing. It was one of those perfect afternoons where you lose track of time and everything else. Suddenly, I felt something. It wasn't a noise or a movement that caught my attention.
Sometimes I see them staring toward that part of the forest, with their ears pricked and hair standing on end, as if they could hear or smell something I can't detect.
And I prefer the days when you can hear chainsaws working in the forest, because that means there are people there, that there's normal human activity. The days of total silence make me nervous because they remind me of that moment when everything stopped, when I found myself staring at that yellow thing with eyes like six suns, and I knew I had seen something that shouldn't exist in our world. Until today. I don't know what I saw that day, but I know it was something that was watching me with the same intensity that I was watching it. And in those 10 seconds of silence, we both knew we had crossed a line that should not have been crossed. Story 5. I rent a 3-story house downtown, and until 3 days ago, I thought it was the perfect place. It's one of those old houses converted into apartments, with a small garden in the back, surrounded by a high wall and a wire fence. I live there with my roommate, and usually it's a quiet place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happens. That Tuesday afternoon, I had gone down to my bedroom on the first floor to get my makeup. It was around 5:30, and I was supposed to meet some friends later, so I wanted to get ready. My room is directly below my roommate's, and I always leave my makeup on the dresser by the window. I found what I needed and went up to the second floor, where my roommate's room is. She was there organizing her clothes, and we decided to get ready together. It's one of those things we often do: put on music, paint our nails, try on different outfits. It's fun and relaxing. We were up there for about 45 minutes. I remember it perfectly because we had a playlist that lasted exactly 45 minutes, and it had just ended when I decided to go downstairs to get my other bag, the one with my favorite perfume. I went down the stairs and opened my bedroom door. The first thing I saw froze me completely. On the floor, right in the middle of my room, were 3 bags. Not just any bags, but my bags, the 3 I always hung on the hook behind my closet door. They were thrown on the floor, and I immediately realized something was terribly wrong. 2 of them had their shoulder straps cut, not torn, not accidentally broken, but cleanly cut, exactly at the same point on both bags. It was a perfect cut, as if someone had used a razor or a very sharp knife and measured exactly where to cut. The third bag had a cut starting at the exact same spot, but it wasn't finished. It was as if someone had started cutting it and then stopped for some reason. The cut was just as clean as the others, but it only went halfway through the strap. The first thing I did was check if anything was missing. I emptied all 3 bags and laid everything on my bed. My credit card was there, my debit card too. I had about $50 in cash that hadn't been touched. My backup phone was there, headphones worth about $200, an old tablet that still works, and even a pair of gold earrings my grandmother had given me. Nothing was missing, not a single cent, not even the cheapest item. Everything was exactly where it should be. The only thing unusual was that the bags had been cut so precisely and strangely. I stood there looking at everything spread out on my bed, trying to understand what had happened. My window was slightly open. I had left it like that to let in fresh air. But to reach my window from outside
someone would have had to do something practically impossible. First, they would have had to jump over the garden wall, which is about 2 meters high. Then, they would have had to cross the entire garden to reach the house, passing in front of the living room windows, where the TV, PlayStation 4, and some expensive sneakers my roommate had left by the back door. After that, they would have had to get in through my window, which is about 1.5 meters off the ground, requiring climbing. Then they would have had to go up the metal staircase inside the house, which makes a terrible noise every time someone steps on it. That staircase is so loud that we always know when the other person is going up or down. And after doing all that without us hearing, they would have had to cut my bags in that very specific way without taking anything of value, and then leave by the same route silently. It made no sense. None of it made sense. I called my roommate to come downstairs. When she saw the bags on the floor, she was confused as I was. I asked her if she had heard anything while we were upstairs, any strange noise, footsteps, the staircase creaking, anything falling. She said no, she hadn't heard anything unusual. We decided to call the police. I know it sounds exaggerated to call the police over some cut bags, especially when nothing was stolen, but there was something about the whole situation that scared me immensely. It was too specific, too deliberate. It wasn't random or accidental. The police arrived about an hour later. There were 2 officers, an older man and a younger woman, and they seemed to think we were overreacting. But when we showed them the bags and explained what had happened, their attitude changed. The older officer examined the cuts very closely. He said they had definitely been made with a razor or a very sharp knife, and that whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. The cuts were too precise to be casual. What caught their attention most was a wet spot they found on my bedroom carpet. It was a round spot about 5 centimeters in diameter, right next to where the bags had been. The spot looked fresh, like water or some other liquid, but it was already starting to dry. When the police arrived, the spot was almost dry, but you could still see the mark on the carpet. They said it didn't look like blood, but they couldn't identify it without sending it to a lab. They asked me about ex-boyfriends, anyone who might have keys to the house, anyone who could have a problem with me. I told them I couldn't think of anyone. I haven't had a serious relationship in months, and the people who know our address are only close friends and family. They also asked about the house layout. I explained how difficult it would be for someone to get in from outside without us seeing or hearing them. The house has a very specific layout with creaky stairs and narrow hallways where it's impossible to move without making noise. After examining everything, the officers said it was probably someone who knew the house, someone who knew exactly where we were and how much time they had to do whatever they did, but they couldn't explain how they got in and out without us hearing. Before leaving, the older officer asked me about our neighbor. There's an older man who lives next door and sometimes complains about the noise we make, especially when we play music or when my friends visit. But he has always been polite about it. He has never been aggressive or strange. I told them I didn't think it was him. He's about 70 years old. I don't think he could climb walls or windows. Also, why would he cut my bags without taking anything? It made no sense. That night,
we decided to sleep together in my roommate's room on the second floor. I didn't want to stay alone in my room, and she didn't want me there either. We dragged an extra mattress and put it on the floor of her room, but I couldn't sleep at all.
We stared at each other for what felt like hours to me, but were probably only about 10 seconds. In those 10 seconds, the world came to a complete stop. Not only was the forest silent, but it was as if time itself had frozen. There was no wind, no sound, no movement of any kind. It was as if someone had pressed pause on all of reality except for the two of us. My mind was racing, trying to find an explanation for what I was seeing. I thought of a bear, but no bear stands upright like that, and no bear has skin that color. I thought of a sick person, maybe someone with some rare medical condition, but the shape of the body wasn't human. I thought of someone high on drugs, maybe someone who had taken something that put them in a strange state. But nothing I knew about drugs could explain that appearance. During those seconds, I felt the most intense sense of danger I have ever experienced in my life. It wasn't normal fear, like the fear you feel when watching a horror movie or when someone startles you. It was something more primitive, deeper. It was as if every cell in my body was screaming at me to get out of there immediately, to run as fast as I could and not look back. But at the same time, I was completely paralyzed. I couldn't move a single muscle. It was as if my body had decided on its own that if I stayed perfectly still, maybe that thing wouldn't see me, or maybe nothing bad would happen. Like when animals play dead to avoid predators. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it moved. It didn't walk toward me like I thought it would. Instead, it slowly turned, unhurried, as if it had all the time in the world. Its movement was strange, too fluid to be human, but too deliberate to be an animal. It turned completely to the left and began walking toward the trees. But the way it walked was the most disturbing thing of all. Its legs moved, but it was as if its feet weren't really touching the ground. It made no sound as it walked, no crunching of dry leaves, no snapping of twigs. It was as if it were floating about a centimeter above the ground. And when it reached the tree line, it simply disappeared among them. It didn't push branches aside, it didn't make the leaves move, it left no trace that it had passed through. It was as if the trees had opened to let it through and then closed again. The moment it disappeared from my sight, all the sounds of the forest came rushing back at once. Birds started singing again. The wind began to move the leaves. I could hear squirrels running through the trees. It was as if someone had unpaused the world and everything returned to normal. But I felt anything but normal. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and I was sweating cold despite the heat. My hands were shaking, and I realized I had been holding my breath the entire time. The first thing I wanted to do was run. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there as fast as possible, but at the same time, I was afraid to move. I was afraid that if I made noise, that thing would come back. I was afraid it was hiding among the trees, waiting for me to move so it could jump on me. I stood there for several more minutes, staring at the spot where it had disappeared, expecting it to reappear. But nothing happened. The forest continued with its normal sounds, as if nothing had occurred. Eventually, I managed to force my legs to move. I didn't run because I was afraid of making too much noise, but I walked back toward my grandparents' house as fast as I could without running. Every few steps, I looked back to make sure it wasn't following me. When I arrived at the house, my grandparents were sitting on the porch drinking iced tea. My grandmother looked at me and immediately knew something was wrong. She asked me what had happened, and I tried to tell her what I had seen.
I told her there was something strange in the forest, something that was neither human nor animal. I described its height, the color of its skin, the strange way it moved. My grandmother listened without interrupting, nodding from time to time. When she finished, she was silent for a moment, staring toward the forest. Then she told me it probably was a person, maybe someone who was sick or someone who was lost and confused. She said that people who get lost in the woods can sometimes behave strangely, especially if they've gone a long time without food or sleep. But I knew it hadn't been a normal person. A person doesn't move the way that thing moved. A person can't walk without making noise in a forest full of dry leaves and branches. A person can't make all the sounds of the forest stop just by being there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking about those yellow eyes, the way it had looked at me, how it had disappeared into the trees without leaving a trace. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that tall, yellow figure standing in the middle of the path. The next day, I decided to return to the same place to see if I could find any trace of what I had seen. I took one of my grandparents' dogs with me, thinking that if there was something dangerous, the dog would alert me. But when we reached the spot where I had seen the creature, the dog became very nervous. It started whining and pulling on the leash, trying to drag me back toward the house. Its fur stood on end and began growling toward the trees where I had seen the thing disappear. I searched the entire area, trying to find footprints, broken branches, anything that would indicate something had been there. But I found nothing. Not a single footprint, not a branch out of place, not even trampled leaves. It was as if nothing had ever happened there. For the rest of my visit to my grandparents' house, I avoided that trail. Every time I went for a walk, I took different routes, and when I had to pass near that area, I always brought one of the dogs with me, because I had noticed they avoided that place too. When they got close to that part of the forest, they became nervous and tried to take other paths. Years have passed since then, and I've tried to find explanations for what I saw. I've read about creatures from the folklore of the native peoples of the area. I've researched rare animals. I've looked for reports of people lost in the forest around that time, but I've never found anything that matches what I saw. Sometimes I wonder if I really saw it, or if my mind created the whole experience. But when I think about those specific details, the texture of its skin, the exact way it moved, that overwhelming sense of danger, I know it was real. It's not the kind of thing you can invent or imagine with that level of detail. What disturbs me the most isn't what I saw, but the way everything stopped when we saw each other. Those 10 seconds of total silence, as if the world had decided it didn't want to witness what was happening, as if even nature knew that thing shouldn't exist. And the way it disappeared without a trace, as if it had never been there, as if it were something that exists in the spaces between things, something that can only be seen when the conditions are exactly right, when the moment is precise. Now, when I visit my grandparents, I still avoid that trail, not because I'm afraid of seeing that thing again, but because I'm afraid of not seeing it. Because if it's there and I can't see it, what does that mean? That I'm incapable of seeing what truly exists in the forest? Or that the thing has learned to hide better? My grandparents' dogs are old now, but they still avoid that area.
That's when I was finally able to move. I ran down the trail back home with Max running beside me. I could hear the sound of her dragging herself behind us, the leaves crunching under her weight, but I didn't dare look back to see how close she was. We ran what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. My lungs were burning and I had a sharp pain in my side, but I didn't dare stop until we reached our yard. That's when I finally looked back. She was gone. She wasn't running after us. She wasn't on the path. Nowhere I could see. At first, I thought maybe she had hidden behind a tree or taken another route, but then I realized something that froze my blood. At the exact spot where I had last seen her crawling toward us, the path was empty. But not empty as if she had vanished while running. Empty as if she had never been there. What disturbed me most was that there was no trace of anyone having crawled through the mud. The path was exactly as it always had been, as if nothing had happened there. But I knew what I had seen. Max knew too. He kept trembling and staring at the trail, ears back and tail between his legs. When I got home, I tried to tell my mom what had happened, but she didn't believe me. She said I had probably just seen some local girl playing and my imagination had filled in the rest, that I had been impressed by the stories told in class, and that made me see things that weren't really there. But I knew it wasn't my imagination, and Max knew too. Over the following weeks, I tried to walk that trail again, but every time we reached the spot where I had seen her, Max refused to go further. He would plant himself there, start that same low whine, and there was no convincing him to keep walking. One day, about a month later, I decided to try it alone, without Max. I thought maybe he just remembered the scare, and that's why he didn't want to go through there. But when I reached that point on the trail, I felt something strange myself. It was like a cold shiver running up my spine, and a weird smell, like wet earth mixed with something I couldn't identify. I didn't see anything, but the sensation was so strong that I couldn't force myself to keep going. I turned around and went home. And since then, I've never attempted to walk that trail again. Years have passed since that day, and I've tried to find rational explanations. Maybe it was a real girl with a medical condition. Maybe her eyes looked strange because of a vision problem. Maybe fear made me see things that weren't there. But there are things I cannot explain. The way she turned her head without moving her body. The artificial way she spoke, as if she was learning to be human. The fact that she disappeared without a trace, as if swallowed by the earth. And above all, Max's reaction. That dog had never been afraid of anything in his life, but that day, he was terrified. Animals know things we do not. They can sense when something isn't right, when something isn't what it seems. Sometimes when I drive past that area, I still look at the trail. I've never seen anything strange again, but I always have that feeling that something is there, waiting. Something that looks like a little girl, but really isn't. And Max, now an old dog, still gets nervous when we pass by. He pants and shifts restlessly in the back seat, as if remembering something he'd rather forget. I don't know what that thing was I saw that day. I don't know if it was supernatural or a real person with something terribly wrong. But I do know that every time someone mentions the black-eyed children, I get goosebumps and remember those perfect black eyes reflecting my distorted face as if they were two mirrors into nothingness. And to this day, I cannot walk that trail without wondering if she's still there, waiting for the next child walking alone down the path, asking if she can touch their dog, touch their hair, hold their hand. Story 4. I was 15 when I saw that thing in the forest, and even today, 20 years later, I still cannot explain what it was. I was spending the end of summer on my grandparents' property near the lands of the town of Canold in Washington. It was one of those places where I had grown up running among dogs and giant pine trees, where I knew every trail and every tree for as long as I could remember. That August day, I had decided to walk alone along one of my favorite trails. It was a path I had traveled thousands of times, stretching from my grandparents' house to a small clearing where we sometimes had picnics.
My grandparents had 3 dogs, but that day none of them wanted to come with me, which was usual because they always followed me everywhere. They stayed lying on the porch, watching me leave, but none got up to follow. It was around 6 p.m. when the sun is beginning to set, but there's still enough light to walk safely. The forest was in that transition between day and night, when everything looks a bit darker, but it isn't night yet. I liked walking at that hour because it was when the most life could be seen. Squirrels running through the trees, birds singing, sometimes even a deer crossing the trail. But that day, the forest felt strange, too silent. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I thought maybe it was because of the hour, or because there had been a lot of people walking that day, and the animals had been scared. But the further I walked, the more I realized it was total silence. Not a single bird, not even the wind rustling the leaves. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I had been walking for about 20 minutes when I reached a part of the trail I knew perfectly. It was a straight stretch with no curves, where you could see far ahead between the pine trunks. And there, standing exactly in the middle of the path, was something that shouldn't have been there. At first, I thought it was a person. It was tall, with the general shape of a human. It was standing on 2 legs, but something in my brain immediately told me it wasn't normal. It was too tall, probably around 2 meters, maybe more, and there was something about the way it stood that looked wrong. I stopped completely and stared, trying to understand what I was seeing. It was about 50 meters away, far enough that I couldn't see details, but close enough to know something was very wrong. Its skin was a sickly yellow, like it was very ill, or like the color people take when they're about to die. But it wasn't just pale yellow, it was a dirty yellow, like old butter, and it seemed too large for its body. It was like a normal person stuffed into a skin suit 3 sizes too big. It hung from its arms and legs like it was too heavy, creating strange folds where there shouldn't be folds. It had hair, but it wasn't normal human hair. It was black and gray strands that seemed randomly attached to its head and parts of its body, as if someone had grabbed handfuls of dirty hair and stuck them wherever. Tufts of hair grew from his arms in weird places and on his legs too. But what disturbed me most were its eyes. They were yellow like its skin, but round and large, too big for its face. It didn't blink, just stood there staring directly at me with those fixed yellow eyes. And where his genitals should have been, there was nothing, just smooth skin, the same sickly yellow as the rest of its body.
I lived in a small village in the hills of England, one of those places where everyone knows each other and news travels faster than the wind. It was the kind of place where the most exciting thing that ever happened was when Mrs. Thompson lost her cat and the whole village went out to look for it. That day had been normal until the afternoon. It was a Friday in October. I remember it perfectly because we had just turned in an assignment on urban legends for our literature class. The teacher had asked us to research local myths, and some of my classmates had presented genuinely disturbing stories. One talked about the black-eyed children, those kids with completely black eyes who supposedly showed up asking for help. Another told the story of a woman who appeared on rural roads asking for a ride home. All of it had made me a little nervous, but also curious. It was that strange mix of fear and fascination you get when you're a teenager. When I got home, my dog, a golden retriever named Max, was waiting for me at the door, wagging his tail like crazy. Max was the bravest dog I've ever known.
He was never afraid of anything, not thunder, not fireworks, not even the biggest dogs in town. I decided to take him for a walk along the trail that led to the golf course. It was a route I knew by heart. I'd walked it hundreds of times since I was a kid. The path started in our backyard, passed through a small wooded area, and then opened up into a more open space where the village golf course was. It was my favorite walk, especially in autumn, when the leaves changed color and crunched underfoot. We left the house around 5 p.m. The sun was already starting to set, but there was still enough light to walk without any trouble. Max ran back and forth as usual, sniffing everything along the path. I had my headphones on, listening to music, not thinking about anything in particular. The first 15 minutes of the walk were completely normal. We followed the usual trail, past the trees I'd known my whole life, and Max behaved like he did every other day. But when we reached the part of the path that opened toward the golf course, something changed. First, it was the wind. Suddenly, it became much colder, as if a cloud had passed in front of the sun. But when I looked up, the sky was still clear. The wind also changed direction and began blowing straight toward us, kicking up dry leaves and small stones from the path. That's when something got into my eye. It was a small pebble, or maybe sand, but it hurt badly, and I had to stop to try to get it out. I took off my headphones and started blinking hard, trying to make my eyes water enough to flush out whatever was in there. While I was standing there rubbing my eye, I noticed that Max had stopped running. I looked at him, and he was completely still, like a statue, staring straight ahead down the path. His tail wasn't moving, his ears were stiff and upright, and he had that rigid posture dogs get when they sense something dangerous. I told him to keep going, that it was nothing, but he didn't move. He stayed planted there, and when I tried to pull on the leash, he resisted. Max never resisted walking, especially not on his favorite route. He started making a strange sound, like a low whimper, and pressed himself against my leg as if trying to hide behind me. That's when I saw her. About 3 meters in front of us, right in the middle of the path, stood a girl. She had her back to us, completely motionless, as if she had been standing there forever. She was wearing a white dress that reached down to her ankles, but it was completely covered in mud. Not normal mud, like the kind you splash into when it rains. This was thick, dark mud that looked like it had dried in layers on the fabric. The girl had long black hair, but it was dirty and tangled, as if it hadn't been washed in days. Her skin was so pale, it almost seemed to glow in the dim afternoon light. It was an unnatural paleness, like she hadn't seen the sun in months. My first thought was that she was a local girl who had gotten lost or was playing outside. Maybe she had fallen into a puddle, and that's why she was so dirty. I called out to her and asked if she was all right, but she didn't respond. She didn't even move. Max kept making that low whining sound and tried to pull me backward. I had never seen him behave like this. It was as if he knew something I didn't, as if every instinct in his body was screaming at him to get away. I stepped a little closer. Max still didn't move. I reached out my hand to touch her shoulder to see if she was all right. And that's when the strangest thing of all happened. She turned her head. Not her body, just her head. And it wasn't a normal movement. It was as if her head was independent from the rest of her body.
as if it could rotate far more than it should. She turned it completely toward me, 180 degrees, while her body continued facing forward. And her eyes, God, her eyes. They had no pupils, no irises, no whites. They were completely black, like two perfect holes in her face. Not black like hair or black clothing, black like space, like you could fall into them if you stared too long. They were so smooth and shiny that they reflected my distorted face like two black mirrors. And then she spoke. Her voice was completely flat, without emotion, like a computer recording. She asked if she could touch my dog, just like that. "Can I touch your dog?" It didn't sound like a normal child asking a question. It sounded mechanical, artificial. I said no. I don't know why, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to say no. Max was trembling against my leg, and I could feel my own heart pounding so hard I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. She tilted her head to one side, the way dogs do when they're confused, and asked if she could touch my hair. The same flat voice, the same total lack of emotion. "Can I take your hand?" And this time, her voice started to change. It was still flat, but now it sounded slightly different, like she was trying to imitate the tone of a normal child, like she was learning how to sound human, but wasn't doing it very well. I said no again, louder this time. And that's when her expression changed completely. She started to cry, but they weren't normal tears. The tears flowed out of those perfect black eyes, but her face showed no emotion at all. It was as if someone had turned on a faucet in her eyes, and the water was just pouring out, without any feeling behind it. Her voice changed too. Now it sounded like a small child crying, but there was still something artificial about it, like she was copying the sound, without truly understanding what it meant. She kept asking to touch my hair, to touch my dog, to take my hand, now in that fake, sobbing voice. I was completely paralyzed. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It was as if my body had forgotten how to function. Max was practically hiding behind my legs, trembling as if he were cold, even though it wasn't cold at all. And then something in my brain clicked. I don't know exactly what it was, but suddenly I knew I had to get out of there immediately, as if my life depended on it. I turned my body to start running, and that's when she moved. She dropped to her knees in the mud of the path and began pulling at her hair with her hands. Not like someone tugging at their hair in frustration. She was ripping out entire clumps with such force that I could see her pale scalp between the strands she tore away. And then she started crawling toward us. She didn't walk. She didn't run. She crawled on her hands and knees, but in a way that didn't look natural. Her movements were too fast, too smooth, as if she had no bones, or as if her joints were different from ours.
In the dream, I was in my bedroom, but everything was upside down. The religious icons my grandmother had given me were falling off the walls and catching fire in midair. The wooden crucifix above my bed was melting as if it were made of wax. At the center of all that chaos was an angel, but it wasn't like the angels from the paintings I had seen in church. This one held an enormous sword made of a metal that looked red hot, and it was fighting something I couldn't see clearly. It was like a dark mass, twisting and constantly changing shape. The angel was winning the fight, stabbing that dark thing again and again with its sword,
until it finally disintegrated with a scream that woke me up. But the strange thing was that in the dream, I wasn't afraid. It was as if I knew the angel was there to protect me. I had that same dream for 3 nights in a row. It was always exactly the same. The icons falling, the crucifix melting, the angel with the sword fighting that dark mass, and it always ended the same way, with that scream that woke me up at exactly 4 a.m. The 4th night was different. I woke up as usual at 4, but this time it wasn't because of the scream in the dream. It was because something had changed in my room. The air felt heavier, like before a storm, and there was a soft light that didn't seem to come from anywhere I could see. At the foot of my bed, there was a figure. It wasn't the shadow with the red tongue I had seen the first night. This one was different. It was white, almost transparent, as if it were made of mist, but it had a human shape. It had no defined features, but somehow I knew it was looking at me. I should have been afraid. I should have screamed or run away, but I felt none of that. Instead, I was overwhelmed by a sense of peace so intense it almost hurt. It was as if every muscle in my body relaxed at the same time, as if a giant hand were gently stroking me from the inside. The figure stayed there for several minutes, radiating that feeling of calm. Then it slowly faded away, like smoke dispersing in the wind. And when it disappeared completely, I fell asleep. It was the first time in weeks that I slept deeply until morning. I woke up feeling better than I had in months. It was as if an enormous weight had been lifted off me. The house felt different too, lighter, more normal. During breakfast, my mom commented that she had slept better than ever. My brother looked more rested as well. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. There were no more figures in my room. The crickets never returned at 3 a.m. for exactly 1 minute. The blue-gray fog stopped rising from the basement. My bed no longer moved at night, as if someone had flipped a switch and our house had gone back to being a normal home. For a few months, I thought it was over for good. I graduated from high school, started making plans for college, and what had happened during those weeks slowly turned into a blurry memory, almost as if it had happened to someone else. But then, my brother came to talk to me. It was a Saturday morning, and he had that look on his face, the one he gets when he's scared but trying to hide it. He sat on my bed and said, "Do you remember those strange dreams you used to have last year?" I told him yes, even though I didn't remember them very clearly anymore. "I had them too," he said, "exactly the same. The falling icons, the angel with the sword, everything. But they weren't normal angel dreams. In my dreams, there were gray children in a cornfield, and the angel was protecting them from something." My blood ran cold. I had never told anyone the details of my dreams. "And this morning," my brother continued, "when I was leaving for school, I looked out my bedroom window and saw something in the backyard. It was a black figure with a red tongue, just like the one you described. It was standing by the tree, looking towards the house." I didn't know what to say. I had thought everything was over, but apparently whatever was in our house was still there, waiting. My mom also started reporting strange things. She said she saw orbs of light moving across the ceiling of her bedroom at night. At first, we thought they were headlights from cars passing on the street, but her bedroom faced the backyard. There was no way car lights could reach that far.
My boyfriend, who had started staying over on weekends, had his own experience. One night, he woke me up by shaking my shoulder. He was sweating and trembling. "There's something in the hallway," he whispered. "I saw some kind of black cloak moving, like a person wearing a cape, but there was no one there." I told him it had just been a dream, but in the morning, we found 3 parallel marks on his back, as if something with claws had scratched him while he slept. The marks were shallow, but perfectly straight, far too precise to have been accidental. That is when I started putting the pieces together. I remembered that when I was 15, I played a Ouija board with some friends. Nothing dramatic had happened at the time, just the letters moving strangely and the candles going out their own way. But I also remembered something else. A few weeks before that, we explored an abandoned house. It was on the edge of town and had been empty for years. Teenagers always went there because we knew no one would bother us, but there was something about that house that gave all of us chills. There were pentagrams drawn on the walls with what looked like red paint, and all the mirrors were broken, but not accidentally. It was as if someone had systematically smashed them, leaving only empty frames with shards of glass on the floor. Whenever I tried to take photos with my phone in that house, it would glitch. The screen would go black, or the app would close on its own. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but it happened every time. It was as if something didn't want to be photographed. Now I wonder if we brought something back from that house with us, if we awakened something that later followed us home. Because no matter how hard I try to find another explanation for what happened, I can't. The crickets that chirped at exactly 3 a.m. for exactly 1 minute, the blue fog that rose from the basement every night at the same time, the white figure that brought me that incredible sense of peace and then made everything stop. And the strangest thing of all, the fact that after that figure appeared, our house felt like a normal home again, as if something had come to cleanse what was wrong, to put things back in order. Sometimes I wonder if the angel from my dreams was real, if there really was a battle I couldn't see, and if that white figure at the foot of my bed was its way of telling me that it had won, that we were safe. Years have passed since then, and I've never experienced anything like it again. My family moved out of that house the following year, and the new owners never reported anything strange. But every time I pass down that street, I look at the second-floor windows and wonder if there's still something up there, waiting. The real moment of terror wasn't seeing the shadow with the red tongue, or hearing the crickets, or feeling my bed move. It was realizing that our home had become a battlefield between forces I couldn't understand, and that we were just spectators in something far bigger than our ordinary lives. And to this day, I don't know if it truly ended, or if it simply learned to hide better. Story 3. I was 14 years old when this happened, and to this day, I can't pass through that area without getting goosebumps.
During the day, when the sun illuminated it completely, it looked like a normal, ordinary building, but I knew there was something there that shouldn't be. And the strangest thing of all was that I couldn't turn my back on that building. It was as if my body had developed a survival instinct that forced me to keep it within my field of vision at all times. Even at noon, when the sun was at its highest and the shed looked as harmless as any other structure, I couldn't relax unless I could see it. One day, I tried to go back up to the loft. I climbed the ladder, and opened the door, but I couldn't go in. It was as if there were an invisible wall preventing me from crossing the threshold. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something deeper, as if every cell in my body were screaming at me that I didn't belong there. I stood in the doorway for several minutes, trying to force myself to enter. I had left some of my paintbrushes up there, and my parents had told me I had to go get them, but I couldn't. It was stronger than me. Every time I tried to take a step forward, I felt as if something was pushing me back. In the end, Carlos had to go up and retrieve my things. He didn't feel anything strange, he told me. To him, the loft was still the same place it had always been. But when I asked him if he had heard anything while he was up there, he went quiet for a moment and then said, "Yeah, like someone was walking around downstairs, but when I looked, there was no one there." Years have passed since then, and I still can't explain what happened that afternoon. I've read about paranormal phenomena, watched television shows about haunted houses, and talked to people who claim to have had similar experiences, but none of it has given me an answer that makes sense. The only thing I know for sure is that something was in that shed that afternoon, something that knew we were watching it and decided to show us that it didn't care about being recorded. Something that could move a heavy camera with the precision of a clockmaker and leave it balanced in a position that defied every law of physics I knew. And the most terrifying thing of all is that to this day I still can't turn my back on that building. My parents sold the house 5 years ago, but every time I pass down that street, my body tenses and my eyes automatically search for that shed. It's as if something inside me remembers that there is something there that shouldn't exist, something that is waiting for the perfect moment to remind me that I never truly left that place. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about that little blue light that disappeared, about that dull thud we heard in the recording, about the impossible way the camera was left balancing in a position that defied every law of physics I knew. Story 2. Growing up in that house in New Jersey was like living in a nightmare I didn't realize was a nightmare until it was over. It was my last year of high school. I was 17 years old and thought the worst thing that could happen to me was not getting into the college I wanted. How wrong I was. The house was strange from the very beginning. My parents had bought it cheap because it had been empty for 2 years, and whenever we asked why, the neighbors would always change the subject. It was one of those old Victorian houses with too many dark corners and staircases that creaked for no reason. But we were young and needed space, so we didn't pay much attention to the warning signs. Everything started one October night. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I had had a chemistry exam and came home exhausted. I went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. There was something in my room that wouldn't let me relax, that feeling you get when you know someone is watching you, even though no one is there. I stayed awake until very late, tossing and turning in bed, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me because I was tired and the room was dark. But when I looked toward the corner next to my closet, it was there. A tall figure, completely black, like the shadow of a person, but three-dimensional. What struck me most was its tongue. It was red, a bright, vivid red that seemed to glow on its own, and it hung out of its mouth
as if it were too long to fit inside. I lay there frozen, staring at that thing for what felt like hours. It didn't move. It just stood there as if it were studying me. I tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, that I was dreaming while awake. Every time I blinked, it was still there. The tongue swayed slightly, as if it were breathing. I squeezed my eyes shut and counted to 10. When I opened them, it was gone. I stayed awake until dawn, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The next morning, I told my younger brother. He laughed and said I'd been watching too many horror movies. My parents thought the same. Senior year stress, my mom said. You need to sleep more. I knew what I had seen, but I started to doubt myself. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was just my imagination. That night, I went to bed earlier, hoping to sleep better. But at exactly 3 a.m., I woke up. I don't know what woke me, but suddenly I was completely alert, as if someone had flipped a switch in my brain. And then it started. It was as if thousands of crickets had invaded the house, all at once. The sound was deafening. It came from everywhere, the walls, the ceiling, under my bed. But it wasn't a normal cricket chirp. It was high-pitched, almost metallic, as if they were screaming. I looked at my alarm clock, exactly 3 a.m. The noise lasted exactly 1 minute. At 3:01, it stopped, as if someone had turned off a radio. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was so complete that I could hear my own breathing, amplified, as if I were inside an empty chamber. I lay there trembling, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. The rest of the night was normal, if you can call it normal to stay awake until 6 a.m., afraid to close your eyes. The days that followed were strange. During the day, everything seemed normal, but at night, the house felt different. It was as if it woke up when it got dark. I started noticing small things. Doors I had left open were suddenly closed. Footsteps in the hall when everyone was in their rooms. Sudden drops in temperature in certain areas of the house. And then the fogs began. The first time I saw it, I thought there was a problem with the basement heating system. It was a blue-gray fog that rose up the stairs like smoke, but it didn't smell like anything. It came out of the basement every night, always at the same time, 3 a.m. It spread across the entire ground floor and then slowly dissipated until it disappeared. My brother saw it too. One night he went down to the kitchen for water and came running back upstairs, pale as a sheet. He said, "There's smoke all over the house," but when we went down to check, there was nothing, only a strange smell, like rusted metal mixed with damp earth. Things got worse quickly after that. My bed started moving at night, not violent movements, but as if someone were sitting on the edge and gently rocking it. At first, I thought my brother was playing a prank on me, but one night I pretended to be asleep, and it felt it. The mattress sank slightly near my feet, and then that slow, steady rocking began. I opened my eyes suddenly, and there was no one there. But the bed kept moving for a few more seconds, as if whatever was causing it took a moment to realize that I was awake. And then the dreams began. They weren't normal dreams. They were so vivid that when I woke up, it took me several minutes to realize they hadn't been real.
Hello, everyone. I'm here to help you fall asleep tonight. So before you drift off, I'd like each of you to leave a comment letting me know what part of the world you're listening from. Also, give the video a like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. I was 13 years old when my world turned upside down. We lived in a 2-story house, nothing special, but there was something that belonged completely to me. The loft of the shed, about 9 meters behind the kitchen door. It was my refuge, my place to escape the noise of the house, where I could listen to music and paint without anyone bothering me. That October afternoon started like any other. The sun was already setting when I climbed the wooden ladder that creaked under my feet. I was carrying my Walkman and some new paintbrushes I had bought with the money I was given for my birthday. The loft had those barn-style doors that let in a strip of golden light, and whenever I opened them, I always felt that sensation of being in my own secret world. I put on some music and sat on the floor to paint. About an hour must have passed when I started hearing noises coming from below. At first, I thought it was my dad looking for something among his tools, but there was something strange about the sounds. It was as if someone were rummaging through the toolboxes, making the metal lids clang against each other. Then I heard footsteps, constant back and forth pacing that didn't have the normal rhythm of someone doing something specific. I took off my headphones and the music cut off abruptly. The noises were still there, those footsteps moving from one side of the shed to the other. I shouted from upstairs, "Dad, is that you?" Total silence. The footsteps stopped. I waited a few seconds and shouted again, "Is anyone there?" Nothing. But I had that horrible feeling in my stomach, the kind you get when you know something isn't right, but you can't explain why. I climbed down from the loft and ran toward the house. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I called my friend Carlos, who lived a few blocks away. I told him what had happened, and he, who had always been braver than me, said, "Let's find out what it is. My dad has a new video camera. We can use it to record and see if anything happens when we're not there." Half an hour later, Carlos arrived with that big camera his dad had bought to record his soccer game. It was one of those with a little blue light that turned on when it was recording. We went up to the loft and placed the camera pointing directly at the barn doors, where that strip of golden light came in, now much dimmer because it was almost dark. We started recording. The little blue light turned on, and I stared at it for a moment, memorizing exactly where it was so I could find it later. I told Carlos, though really I was just trying to make sure everything was working properly, and we turned off the lights in the loft and went back down, closing the door behind us. We stayed in the kitchen drinking water and trying not to talk too loudly. Carlos asked me questions about what I had heard, but my mind was on that little blue light. For some reason, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It felt like my connection to whatever was happening up there. Exactly 20 minutes passed. I know this because Carlos had one of those digital watches that beep every hour, and it had been 20 minutes since we came down when we decided to go back up. I went first with a flashlight in my hand, and Carlos followed close behind. I opened the loft door, and the first thing I did was look for that little blue light. It wasn't where we had left it. It wasn't anywhere.
The flashlight beam landed on the camera, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The camera was tipped over, not lying on one of its wide sides like it normally would if it had fallen, but balanced on one of its corners, as if an invisible hand had pushed it past the point where it would naturally fall. "How can it be standing like that?" Carlos whispered behind me. He was right. For a camera to end up in that position, someone or something would have to flip it completely twice and then leave it balancing on that corner, as if an invisible hand had pushed it past the point where it would naturally fall. I ran out of that loft as if something was chasing me. Carlos was right behind me, shouting my name, but I couldn't stop. My heart was in my throat, and I felt like I couldn't breathe properly. We reached the kitchen and stayed there, breathing heavily, staring at each other without knowing what to say. After a few minutes, Carlos went back up to retrieve the camera. I stayed downstairs because I couldn't force my legs to climb that ladder again. When he came down with it, we connected it to the television to see what it had recorded. The first few minutes showed nothing, just the empty loft with that strip of golden light growing dimmer and dimmer. We could hear our voices from the kitchen, very faint. Everything seemed normal, until suddenly there was a dull thud, as if something heavy had hit the floor. On the screen, we saw the camera start to move. First, it slowly tilted to one side, as if someone were pushing it very carefully. Then it began to rotate, and we could see the angle of the image gradually changing. The camera kept turning until it was pointing at the back wall, exactly the way we had found it. But the most terrifying part of all was that there was no one there. The recording showed the loft completely empty. There was no figure, no shadow, nothing to explain how the camera moved on its own. It was as if an invisible hand had pushed it, had spun it exactly twice, and then left it balancing in that impossible position. "Look," Carlos said, rewinding the video. We watched the moment when it started to move over and over again. The camera began to tilt very slowly, then spun faster, and finally tipped past the point where it should have stopped. It was as if something had pushed it with the exact amount of force needed to leave it balanced on that corner, defying gravity. But what scared me the most wasn't seeing the camera move. It was realizing something that made me feel as if the ground had opened beneath my feet. The shed had responded to our trap. We had put the camera there to record in secret, to capture whatever it was that was making those noises, and at the exact moment the camera was watching, something touched it. It was as if whatever was in that shed knew we were observing it, as if it waited for us to set up the camera to prove that it could do whatever it wanted, even while being recorded. That idea terrified me more than any ghost or monster I could have imagined. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking about that dull thud we heard in the recording, about the deliberate way the camera moved, about how it had been left balancing in that impossible position. It was as if something wanted to send us a message. I know you're there. I know I'm watching you, and you can see me do this. The next morning, my dad went up to the loft with me to check his tools. Everything was exactly as it always was. Every screw in its place, every hammer hanging where it belonged. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, moving among those boxes, making those metal lids clatter. I showed the video to my dad, but he just told me the camera must have fallen because we hadn't set it up properly. "Cameras are heavy," he said. it probably tipped over on its own. But I knew that wasn't true. We had placed the camera on a flat surface, and even if it had fallen, it never would have ended up balanced on that corner.
Over the following weeks, every time something disappeared from the house, even small things like pens or paper clips, we automatically blamed the pencil man. It was our way of coping with the anxiety, turning it into a sort of family joke, but deep down, we all knew it wasn't funny. What disturbed me the most was thinking about the person who had done this. Someone who had taken the time to get exactly 12 identical pencils, who had entered our house while my mom was there, sharpened each pencil meticulously, opened a closet that was normally locked, and lined everything up perfectly on my dad's desk. This was someone methodical, patient, attentive to details, someone who had observed our house enough to know when my dad left for work, when we went to school, when my mom was home alone. And the scariest part of all was someone who had managed to do all that without being detected, who knew our house better than we did, who could move through it as if it were their own home. Sometimes I think about that morning and imagine that person hiding somewhere in the house, maybe in the study closet, patiently waiting for my dad to leave, waiting for the perfect moment to emerge from their hiding place and begin their strange ritual. I imagine the sound of the pencil sharpener echoing throughout the house while my mom brushed her teeth or applied makeup, unaware of what was happening upstairs. I imagine that person working calmly, sharpening each pencil carefully, maybe even enjoying the fact that my mom could hear what they were doing, but couldn't do anything to stop it. And I wonder if they ever came back, if on one of those nights when we heard strange noises, when we found things out of place, when we felt like someone had been in the house, it was him returning to leave another message. Because that pencil in my mom's car wasn't accidental. It was a signature, a way of saying, I can reach you wherever you are, whenever I want. There is no place where you are completely safe from me. Years have passed since then, and our family has moved out of that house. But every time I hear the sound of an electric pencil sharpener, I am transported back to that morning when my mom realized that someone had been in our house doing something we couldn't understand. And even today, every time I find a perfectly sharpened pencil somewhere it shouldn't be, I wonder if maybe the pencil man has found me again. Story 10. This happened about 3 months ago, and I still can't handle being out at night without getting goosebumps. I was driving home after a party that had lasted much longer than I expected. It was one of those Saturday nights where you completely lose track of time, and when I finally looked at my phone, it was already 3 a.m. I live in a fairly rural area of England, and to get to my house, I have to take a road that passes through several kilometers of dense forest. It's a typical English country A road, with sharp bends, hills that rise and fall, and huge trees forming a kind of natural tunnel over the asphalt. During the day, it's a beautiful route, but at night, it can be unsettling, especially when you're alone. That night was particularly dark. There was no moon, and the only sources of light were my headlights and the few street lamps scattered every kilometer or so. They were those old sodium vapor lamps that cast a weak yellow light, creating more pools of light than actual illumination, surrounded by deep shadows. I had been driving for about 15 minutes when I started feeling uneasy. At first, it wasn't anything specific, just that vague sensation that something was wrong. Maybe it was because I'd had a little to drink at the party, though not enough to be drunk. Maybe it was because I was tired after a long day.
but there was something in the atmosphere that night that made me nervous. The trees on both sides of the road looked denser than usual, more closed in, as if they had leaned toward the road since the last time I passed. It was probably my imagination, but I swear it felt like I was driving through a tunnel that got narrower with each kilometer. I was approaching a section of the road I know very well, a long straight that slopes down a gentle hill before bending to the right. It's a place where I usually accelerate a bit because you can see far ahead and there's almost never any traffic at that hour. That's when I saw it. About 150 meters ahead, something huge and gray shot out from the forest on the left and crossed the road on all fours. It didn't walk, it didn't trot, it launched across the asphalt in a burst of motion that lasted maybe 2 seconds. At first, I thought it was a deer. Deer are common in that area, and it wouldn't have been the first time I saw one cross the road at night, but I immediately knew it wasn't a deer. The shape was completely wrong. It was too large for starters. Deer are big animals, but this thing was enormous, and the way it moved was completely unnatural. It wasn't the smooth gallop of a deer or the heavy trot of a horse. It was like an explosion of elastic motion, as if all its muscles contracted at once to launch it across the asphalt. Its back was arched strangely, curving upward into a hump that didn't look natural. Its limbs were long, too long in proportion to the rest of its body, and moved in a way that reminded me more of a giant spider than any mammal I had ever seen. My entire body reacted before my brain could process what I had just seen. My blood ran cold instantly, as if someone had turned on a faucet of ice in my veins. Cold sweat poured out of my skin so fast I could feel drops running down my back. My vision narrowed as if I was looking through a tunnel, and I had that horrible feeling that I was about to faint. But my survival instinct kicked in faster than the fainting. Instead of braking, which would have been the logical reaction if it were really an animal, I floored the car. My body knew something that my conscious mind was still trying to understand. Whatever I had just seen was not something I wanted to have a close encounter with. The car surged forward so fast I felt my back press against the seat. I passed the spot where the creature had crossed the road at full speed, and out of my corner of an eye, I saw the place where it had disappeared into the trees on the right. There was no trace that it had been there, no broken branches, no disturbed bushes. It was as if it had been absorbed by the forest. But I didn't slow down. I kept my foot to the floor, driving at a speed completely unsafe for that dark, winding road. My body wouldn't let me slow down. Every instinct I had screamed at me to put as much distance as possible between me and that plate as fast as I could. I glanced at the dashboard clock. Exactly 3 a.m. That detail etched itself into my mind with a strange clarity, as if my brain decided it was important to remember. 3 o'clock sharp. No minute more, no minute less. For the next few kilometers, my car felt like a protective cocoon, yet at the same time, it felt terribly fragile. The windows seemed too large, too transparent. The bodywork felt too thin. It was as if I suddenly became aware of how vulnerable I was, alone in this metal box, moving through a forest full of things I didn't understand. My hands on the steering wheel were shaking so violently that it was hard to keep the car in the lane.
It wasn't just fear. It felt like my entire nervous system was overloaded, as if I had seen something my brain didn't know how to process, and my whole body was having a panic response. The most disturbing sensation was that I couldn't get the image of that thing out of my head, not because I was trying to remember it, but because it felt burned into my retinas. Every time I blinked, I saw it again.
That gray, arched, explosive shape launching itself across the road as if the asphalt were just another minor obstacle to overcome. And there was something else bothering me, something my brain had picked up on but hadn't fully processed at the time. The way it moved wasn't just unnatural, it was intelligent. It hadn't thrown itself across the road randomly like a frightened animal would. It had traced a perfectly straight line from point A to point B, as if it knew exactly where it was going and the most efficient way to get there. I didn't get home until 20 minutes later, even though that stretch of road normally takes only 10 minutes. It wasn't because of traffic or because I got lost. It was because I couldn't force my foot off the accelerator until I was in my driveway, with my house lights visible and my front door just a few meters away. When I finally parked the car, I sat there for several minutes before I could force myself to get out. My hands were still shaking, and I had that weak, hollow feeling in my legs you get after a severe scare. It was as if my body had burned through all its adrenaline at once and was now completely exhausted. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying those 2 seconds over and over in my mind. I tried to find rational explanations for what I had seen. Maybe it had been an unusually large deer seen from a strange angle. Maybe it had been a horse that escaped from a nearby farm. Maybe my exhaustion and the alcohol had distorted my perception. But every explanation fell apart when I remembered the specific details. The way its back had arched, the unnatural length of its limbs, the explosive speed of its movement, the intelligence in its trajectory. Over the next few days, I tried to research what large animals live in the forests around that area. Deer, of course. Occasionally some wild horses, maybe escaped livestock, but nothing that matched what I had seen. I also tried to find reports of similar sightings. I searched local newspapers, internet forums, community Facebook groups. I didn't find anything exactly like my experience, but I did find something interesting. Several reports over the past few years of car accidents on that same stretch of road. Cars that had run off the road for no apparent reason. Drivers found in a state of shock, saying they had seen something that scared them so badly they lost control. Most of those reports were attributed to driver fatigue or animals jumping in front of cars. But when I read them all together, there was a strange pattern. They had all happened between 2 and 4 a.m. They had all occurred in the same area where I saw the creature. And in every case, the drivers mentioned seeing something they couldn't properly explain. One driver said it looked like a deformed horse. Another said it looked like a spider the size of a car. A third said it moved as if it were made of rubber, bouncing instead of running. Reading those descriptions gave me goosebumps. They were all different, but they shared something in common, the sense that what they had seen wasn't entirely natural. Since that night, I've avoided driving on that road after midnight. It's not that I have a specific irrational fear of seeing the thing again. It's that I know, with a certainty I can't explain rationally, that it's still there, moving through the forest during those early morning hours when most people are asleep. Sometimes I think about that thing and wonder what would have happened if my instinctive reaction had been different. What if I had braked instead of accelerating? What if I had stopped the car and gotten out to investigate? The rational part of my mind tells me that probably nothing would have happened, that I would have discovered it was just a normal animal seen from a strange angle or under lighting conditions that made it seem more threatening than it really was. But the more primitive part of my brain, the part that reacted with such terror that night, knows something else. It knows that what I saw was not something humans are meant to interact with. It knows that my instinct to flee as fast as possible saved me from something I don't even want to imagine. And there's something else that still bothers me,
something I haven't been able to think about since that night. The way it crossed the road wasn't random, it was calculated. It was as if it knew I would be there at that hour, as if it had been waiting for me, as if it were a test to see whether I was smart enough to get away or stupid enough to get closer. And I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I had failed that test. To this day, every time I drive at night, especially on rural roads, my body tenses involuntarily when it gets close to 3 a.m. because I know that thing is still out there in some forest, waiting for the next car to pass through its territory at the wrong time. And I have a horrible feeling that the next driver who encounters it won't be as lucky as I was. Story 11. When I was between 8 and 10 years old, shadow people were frequent nighttime visitors in my house. I know that sounds strange to say it that way, as if they were neighbors coming over for tea, but that was the reality of my childhood. They appeared so regularly that I got used to them, even though they never stopped giving me chills. The first time I saw one was when I was 8 years old. It was a normal school night. I'd gone to bed early as usual and was in that state between being awake and asleep when I heard my door open. In my house, doors made a very specific sound when they opened, a small creak from the frame, followed by the brush of the door against the carpet. I opened my eyes and saw a completely black figure standing in my doorway. It wasn't the silhouette of someone outlined by the hallway light. It was a solid, three-dimensional figure made entirely of darkness, as if someone had taken the shape of an adult human and filled it with the deepest blackness imaginable. It had no features. I couldn't see eyes, a nose, a mouth, nothing. It was just a perfect human shape made of pure black shadow. But despite having no visible face, I knew it was looking directly at me. The first thing I thought was that it was my dad or my mom coming to check on me. That was something they sometimes did, especially if I had had nightmares or was sick. I asked, "What do you want?" My voice sounded small in the darkness of my room, but it was a genuine question. In my 8-year-old mind, that figure had to be someone in my family, and if they were standing in my doorway, they must have wanted something. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I waited a few seconds and asked again, "Dad? Mom? What do you need?" Total silence. That's when I started to feel that something was wrong. My parents always responded when I spoke to them, especially at night. If one of them had come into my room for some reason, they would have told me what was going on.
As I stared at it, the figure began to dissolve. It didn't walk away. It didn't turn to leave. It simply started to fade, like smoke dispersing into the air. Within seconds, it had completely vanished, leaving my door open and my heart pounding in my chest. The next day, I told my parents what I had seen. They said it had been a dream, or maybe one of them had come to check on me and I had seen them while half asleep. But I knew I had been awake, and I knew that what I had seen looked nothing like either of my parents. The second time happened about 2 weeks later. This time, I woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was watching me. That sensation you get when you know there are eyes on you, even in the dark. I looked toward my door, and there it was again. The same black figure, exactly like the first time, standing in the doorway, completely still, featureless, but clearly watching me. This time, I didn't ask anything. There was something about its presence that made me understand it wasn't someone from my family. It was something different, something that didn't belong in my house. I lay there staring at it, and after a few minutes,
It faded away again in the same manner, as if it were made of black smoke, dissolving into nothing. Over the next 2 years, these visits became routine, not every night, but several times a week. It was always the same pattern. I would wake up feeling watched. I'd look toward my door, and there would be the black figure. It would stay for a few minutes, then disappear. Sometimes they appeared in different places. Once I saw one standing beside my window, as if it were looking out into the backyard. Another time, there was one in the corner of my room, just standing there like a piece of furniture someone had placed there. The strangest part was that they never scared me directly. I didn't feel the immediate terror you'd expect from seeing something like that. It was more of an unease, like knowing something wasn't right, but not being able to identify exactly what it was. I eventually reached the point where I would wake up, see one of those figures, and simply talk to it, asking what it wanted, or telling it to go away because I wanted to sleep. They never responded, but they never seemed threatening either. They were like silent observers. The most intense experience I had with them happened when I was 10 years old. That night felt different from the beginning. I had trouble falling asleep and had that restless feeling you sometimes get for no clear reason. I woke up around 2 a.m. and immediately knew there was something in my room. But this time, it wasn't just one figure, there were 3. One was in its usual place in the doorway, another was by my window, and the third was standing at the foot of my bed. All of them exactly the same, perfect human shapes made of pure black shadow. For the first time in all my experiences with them, I felt real fear. One figure was strange but manageable. 3 figures surrounding my bed was terrifying. I asked them what they wanted, but my voice came out trembling. This time, they didn't fade away like they usually did. They just stood there, watching me from their positions around my room. What happened next was the strangest thing of all. I began to feel sleepy again, despite the fear. It was as if the figures were emanating some kind of forced calm, as if they wanted me to fall asleep. My eyelids grew heavy, and before I realized it, I drifted back to sleep. I woke up the next morning feeling more rested than I had in weeks, as if I'd had the deepest, most restorative sleep of my life. But there was more. During breakfast, my younger sister casually mentioned that she had nightmares all night. She said she dreamed about black men standing in her room, watching her. My sister had never mentioned anything like that before, and I had never told her about my experiences with the shadow figures. But her description was exactly what I had been seeing for years. I asked her for more details, and everything matched perfectly. Human-shaped figures made of shadow with no features appearing in her room at night and then fading away. That was when I realized it wasn't just me. The figures weren't only visiting my room, they were visiting the entire house. Over the following weeks, I started paying closer attention to my family during breakfast. My older brother mentioned once that he had strange dreams about people standing in my room. My mom commented that she had been sleeping poorly, that she felt like someone was in the house at night. No one talked directly about seeing black figures, but everyone was experiencing something related. It was as if the figures were subtle enough to stay just at the edge of the adult's conscious perception, but children could see them clearly.
There was another incident that deeply affected me. One night, I was in the hallway bathroom brushing my teeth before bed. It was a small bathroom with a large mirror above the sink, and I always left the door open because I didn't like being enclosed in small spaces. I was focused on brushing my teeth when I felt that familiar presence. But this time, instead of seeing the figure, I heard it. Someone whispered my name right next to my ear. It wasn't a normal whisper, like when someone tries not to wake others. It was a whisper that felt incredibly close, as if the person's mouth were inches from my ear. But when I looked in the mirror, there was no one behind me, and when I turned around, the hallway was completely empty. I ran out of that bathroom so fast I left my toothbrush clattering into the sink. I ran downstairs screaming for my parents, saying that someone had whispered my name in the bathroom. My parents came upstairs with me to check, but of course they found nothing. They said it must have been my imagination, or maybe the sound of water in the pipes, or the wind. But I knew what I had heard. Another strange experience happened when we were playing hide and seek in the house. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was hiding in my parents' bedroom closet, waiting for my sister to find me. I had been there for about 10 minutes when I started hearing noises coming from my younger sister's room. They weren't normal searching noises. They sounded like things falling, toys being moved roughly, as if someone were throwing everything onto the floor. I came out of my hiding place to see what was going on. When I got to her room, toys were scattered all over the floor, as if someone had dumped all her toy boxes at once. But my sister wasn't there. I found her in the basement where she had been the entire time, looking for my brother and I. She hadn't gone up to the second floor at all. When we asked her who had made the mess in her room, she had no idea what we were talking about. Our parents were in the backyard. We could see them through the window. There was no one in the house who could have thrown all those toys around. We also had a very strange shared experience with my brother. We both had the same dream on the same night, something that had never happened before and has never happened again. In the dream, there was a large wooden box in our basement that didn't exist in real life. Inside the box was a small girl, about 5 or 6 years old, curled up and crying. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, like something from decades ago, and she had long, dirty hair. In the dream, we went down to the basement and could hear the crying coming from the box. But every time we had tried to approach to help her, the black figures appeared and prevented us from getting closer. The next day, my brother described the exact same dream to me, with all the same details: the wooden box, the crying girl, and the black figures stopping us from helping her. We had never talked about the shadow figures with each other before that.
I used to think it was something that only happened to me, but that shared dream made me realize that my entire family was being affected by the same thing. The most disturbing part wasn't actually seeing the figures themselves. It was the fact that they vanished without making a sound, as if they were reminding me that they had always been there. I just normally couldn't see them. It was as if they were a natural part of the house, as if they had been living there long before we moved in and had simply decided to make themselves visible to the children in the family. When I turned 11, the apparitions started becoming less frequent. By the time I was 12, they had stopped completely. It wasn't a gradual change. It was as if one day they decided they no longer needed to show themselves. But even though I don't see them anymore,
Sometimes I can still feel their presence, especially late at night when the house is completely silent. I get that familiar sensation of being watched. And every time I feel it, what I experience isn't exactly fear. It's more like recognition, like greeting old acquaintances who have chosen to remain invisible, but who are still there, in the dark corners, in the spaces between things, watching and waiting. Sometimes I wonder if they still visit my younger sister, if she sees black figures standing in her room at night. But I never ask her directly, because I know that if she is still seeing them, talking about it might make them disappear. And for some reason I can't explain, I don't want them to disappear completely. Because even though they were strange and sometimes unsettling, they never actually hurt me. They were just there, reminding me that the world has more layers than we are usually able to perceive. To this day, I don't know what those figures really were, but I know they were real, and I know my entire family experienced them in some way, and that's enough for me. Story 12. I live in what people in town call the camp, about 7 kilometers from the nearest city. It's one of those places where people say energy lines cross through the land, although I don't know how true that really is. What I do know is that ever since I was a child, strange things have happened in this area, and most of the neighbors have their own unsettling stories to tell. During the winter, when I was a teenager, I had to walk to the school bus stop in complete darkness. The bus came at 6:20 in the morning, and in the middle of winter, that meant walking along a gravel path for about 10 minutes with no light except a small flashlight. The path started at our house, went through a small forest, and then opened into a large meadow before reaching the main road where the bus stop was. It was a walk I had taken hundreds of times. I knew every rock, every tree, every curve in the path. But that day was different. It was a Tuesday in January. It was brutally cold, and there was a thick fog that made my flashlight almost useless. The beam disappeared into the gray mist and only lit up about a meter in front of me. Still, I knew the path so well that I didn't really need to see much to know where I was going. I had just reached the point where the path opens into the meadow when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. About 50 meters away, in the middle of the empty meadow, there was a figure. It was enormously tall, at least 3 meters, maybe more. It had a completely white head that glowed faintly in the fog, as if it had its own light. Its body was dark, as if it were wearing a black suit or cloak that blended into the shadows. But what struck me the most were its arms. They were absurdly long, far too long for any normal human proportions. They hung at its sides and reached almost to the ground, like a gorilla's arms, but even more exaggerated. At first, I thought it had to be a scarecrow. There were farms in the area, and even though I didn't remember any being near that meadow, maybe someone had put one there and I had just never noticed it. But there were no crops there, just wild grass and a few rocks. I stood there staring at the figure through the fog, trying to convince myself it was something normal. I squeezed my eyes shut, counted to 5 in my head, and then opened them again. It was a thing I did when I thought I might be seeing strange things, my own little test to tell whether it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. The figure was still there, in exactly the same position, completely motionless. I decided to keep walking toward the bus stop. I didn't really have a choice. I had to get to school, and the bus wasn't going to wait for me. But I kept my flashlight pointed toward the figure as I walked, trying not to lose sight of it. As the bus arrived and I got on, I looked out the window toward the meadow. The figure was still there, now smaller because of the distance, but clearly visible against the fog. I asked the bus driver if he saw anything strange in the meadow. He looked where I pointed, frowned, and told me he didn't see anything but fog, but I could still see it clearly. That afternoon, when I got home from school, I walked along the same path, hoping to see what it was I had seen that morning. But the meadow was completely empty. There was no scarecrow, no poles, nothing that could explain what I had seen. The next day, the figure was there again. This time, it was in a different position, closer to the edge of...
I used to think it was something that only happened to me, but that shared dream made me realize that my entire family was being affected by the same thing. The most disturbing part wasn't actually seeing the figures themselves. It was the fact that they vanished without making a sound, as if they were reminding me that they had always been there. I just normally couldn't see them. It was as if they were a natural part of the house, as if they had been living there long before we moved in and had simply decided to make themselves visible to the children in the family. When I turned 11, the apparitions started becoming less frequent. By the time I was 12, they had stopped completely. It wasn't a gradual change. It was as if one day they decided they no longer needed to show themselves. But even though I don't see them anymore, sometimes I can still feel their presence, especially late at night when the house is completely silent. I get that familiar sensation of being watched. And every time I feel it, what I experience isn't exactly fear. It's more like recognition, like greeting old acquaintances who have chosen to remain invisible, but who are still there, in the dark corners, in the spaces between things, watching and waiting. Sometimes I wonder if they still visit my younger sister, if she sees black figures standing in her room at night. But I never ask her directly, because I know that if she is still seeing them, talking about it might make them disappear. And for some reason I can't explain, I don't want them to disappear completely. Because even though they were strange and sometimes unsettling, they never actually hurt me. They were just there, reminding me that the world has more layers than we are usually able to perceive. To this day, I don't know what those figures really were, but I know they were real, and I know my entire family experienced them in some way, and that's enough for me. Story 12. I live in what people in town call the camp, about 7 kilometers from the nearest city. It's one of those places where people say energy lines cross through the land, although I don't know how true that really is. What I do know is that ever since I was a child, strange things have happened in this area, and most of the neighbors have their own unsettling stories to tell. During the winter, when I was a teenager, I had to walk to the school bus stop in complete darkness. The bus came at 6:20 in the morning, and in the middle of winter, that meant walking along a gravel path for about 10 minutes with no light except a small flashlight. The path started at our house, went through a small forest, and then opened into a large meadow before reaching the main road where the bus stop was. It was a walk I had taken hundreds of times. I knew every rock, every tree, every curve in the path. But that day was different. It was a Tuesday in January. It was brutally cold, and there was a thick fog that made my flashlight almost useless. The beam disappeared into the gray mist and only lit up about a meter in front of me. Still, I knew the path so well that I didn't really need to see much to know where I was going. I had just reached the point where the path opens into the meadow
when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. About 50 meters away, in the middle of the empty meadow, there was a figure. It was enormously tall.
The following Monday, when I had to walk to the bus stop again, the figure was there once more, but this time it was different. Instead of standing still in one place, it seemed to be moving slowly, always keeping the same distance from me as I walked. It wasn't walking in a normal way. Its feet didn't seem to touch the ground at all. It was actually gliding across the surface of the meadow as if it were floating, while maintaining that constant distance like a satellite orbiting around me. That was the first time I was truly scared. Up until that point, the figure had been strange, but not threatening. But seeing it move, seeing it actively follow me, made me feel like prey to something I didn't understand. When I reached the bus stop, I turned around and shouted at it. I don't know why I did it. It was pure impulse. I yelled, "Enough! Leave me alone!" My voice echoed across the meadow in the cold morning air. The figure stopped immediately. It remained completely motionless for a few seconds. Then it slowly turned and began to move away. It didn't walk, it slid toward the forest until it disappeared among the trees. And for the first time in weeks, it obeyed. It didn't appear the next day, or the day after that, or for the rest of that week. I thought it was over, that whatever that thing was, it had understood that I didn't want it near me and had left for good. But I was wrong. Years later, when I had my own car and no longer had to walk to the bus stop, my younger brother started having similar experiences. He was 8 years old, and one afternoon he came running into the house saying he had seen a very tall man looking through our living room window. When I asked him to describe what he had seen, his description matched exactly what I had experienced years earlier. An enormously tall man with a white head and very long arms, but this time he had seen it much closer to the house. Over the following weeks, my brother kept reporting sightings. The tall man appeared in different places around our property, next to the barn, at the edge of the forest, once even standing in our backyard. My parents thought it was just the imagination of an 8-year-old child, but I knew it was real. I told my brother to let me know the next time he saw it, no matter the time. One night, around 2 a.m., my brother came into my room saying the tall man was standing outside his window. I ran with him to his room and looked out the window. There it was, exactly as I remembered it. But this time, it was much closer, maybe only about 10 meters from the house. I could see more details than I ever had before. Its head wasn't just white, it seemed to glow with a soft light. Its long arms hung motionless at its sides, but now I could see that they had a strange shape, as if the proportions were completely wrong. And for the first time, I felt that it was looking directly at me, even though I couldn't see eyes or a face from that distance. I knew with absolute certainty that it was aware of my presence, that it knew I was watching it from the window. My brother and I stood there staring out the window for what felt like hours. The figure didn't move, but it didn't disappear either. It was as if it were waiting for something, as if it wanted us to know it was there. Finally, I decided to do the same thing I had done years earlier. I opened the window and shouted at it to go away, to leave us alone. The figure immediately turned and moved away toward the forest,
sliding across the ground in the same strange way I remembered. That was the last time my brother saw it, but it was not the last time it appeared on our property. Over the following years, friends who came to visit us would occasionally mention seeing something strange in the woods around our house. They always described the same thing, an extremely tall figure with long arms seen from a distance among the trees. Most of them didn't believe in anything supernatural before coming to our house. After spending one night there, they would leave shaken and never want to come back. One friend who had come to camp in our backyard ran into the house at midnight, pale and shaking, saying he had seen Slender Man standing at the edge of our yard. I had never told him anything about the tall figure, so his description confirmed to me that it wasn't something we were imagining. To this day, the figure still appears occasionally. I've seen it through the morning fog when I leave early for work. I've seen it standing among the trees when I drive home at night. It doesn't scare me the way it used to. Now it's more like a strange neighbor who keeps his distance, but is always there, reminding me that there are things in this world we don't fully understand. Sometimes I wonder what it really wants, whether it's something territorial, protecting this area, or something more personal, connected specifically to me and my family. I also wonder if there are others like it in other places, watching other families, waiting patiently for reasons only they understand. The only thing I know for certain is that after all these years, it's still there, in the fog, among the trees, at the edges of my vision, watching, waiting, being part of the landscape in ways most people will never notice. And every time someone new comes to our area and mentions seeing something tall and strange in the woods, I know exactly what they're talking about. Because here in the camp, where energy lines supposedly cross, some things never change. They just learn to stay in the shadows until the perfect moment comes to remind you that you never really left their territory. Story 13. This happened about 6 months ago, and I still can't use my phone at night without getting chills. I'd had my iPhone 4S for about 2 years and had never had any strange problems with it. It was one of those phones that worked perfectly, never froze, never did anything weird. Until that night. It was a Wednesday night around 10:30 p.m., and I was lying in bed browsing the internet when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't know, but it looked local based on the area code. Normally, I don't answer calls from unknown numbers, especially that late, but for some reason that night I decided to pick up. On the other end was a woman with a very professional, confident voice. She sounded like one of those people who work in customer service for a large company, polite but very direct. She told me she was calling to verify some of my information for a process that was currently underway. She didn't specify what kind of process, but she sounded official enough that I didn't immediately suspect anything. Besides, it was the kind of call you sometimes get from banks or insurance companies, that sort of thing. She started by asking for my full name. I gave it to her without thinking much about it. Then she asked for my email address. I gave her that too, assuming it might be related to some online account I had opened and forgotten about. Then she asked me to confirm my phone number. I told her that she had called me, so she obviously already had it, but she said it was part of the verification protocol. I repeated my number. Up to that point, everything seemed normal, but then she asked for my physical address, and that was when I realized something was very wrong.
In the same calm, professional voice, she said, "To process you, Sakura." Sakura isn't my real name, but it's the username I use on several internet platforms. It's a name I use for internet things, social media accounts, forums, that kind of stuff. But I never use it for anything official.
I never give it as my real name for banks, companies, or anything legal. The fact that she used that name made me feel like someone had dumped ice-cold water over me. It meant that whoever she was had been researching me online. She had connected my phone number to my internet accounts. She had been collecting information about me. I told her I wasn't going to give my address and that I wanted to know exactly who she was and what she wanted. But instead of answering my questions, she kept insisting in that same calm voice. "I just need your address to complete the process, Sakura." I decided to hang up. I tapped the end call button on my screen, but nothing happened. The call stayed connected, as if the button didn't work. I tapped it again, harder this time, thinking maybe it hadn't registered my touch the first time, but the button didn't respond at all. It was as if that part of the screen had completely stopped working. I tried pressing the lock button on the side of the phone, thinking that if I locked the screen, it might end the call, but it didn't respond either. I pressed it several times, holding it down, but the screen stayed on and the call remained active. Meanwhile, the voice on the other end kept talking, but now it didn't sound exactly the same as before. It was still the same voice, but there was something slightly different about the tone, as if it were becoming a little less human with each word. "What's your address, Sakura? I need your address to process you, Sakura. Where do you live, Sakura?" It used my name in every sentence, which made me more and more nervous. It wasn't natural to speak that way, constantly repeating someone's name. It felt like it was trying to make me feel familiar with it, like it had some kind of personal connection to me. I tried using the power-off slider that appears when you hold down the lock button. I slid the screen to turn the phone off, but nothing happened. The slider moved, but the phone didn't shut down. That was when I truly started to panic. My phone had completely stopped obeying me. I couldn't hang up, I couldn't lock it, I couldn't turn it off. It was as if someone had taken remote control of it, and the voice was still there, now sounding like it was directly in my room with me. Even though I was holding the phone away from my ear, I could hear it clearly, as if it were whispering right beside my head. "Just tell me where you live, Sakura, and this will be over," it said. "It's the only information I'm missing. I already have everything else. I just need to know where to find you." That last sentence terrified me more than anything else. Where to find you. Not where you live or your address. Where to find you, as if it were planning to come get me in person. I sat there holding my phone, which no longer obeyed me, listening to this voice that knew my internet name and wanted to know where I lived. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't hang up. I couldn't shut the phone off. I couldn't make it stop. The voice kept talking, but now there was something definitely unnatural about it. It was technically the same voice, but it sounded like a recording being replayed, or like it was computer-generated. Every time it said my name, it sounded slightly different, as if it couldn't decide exactly how to pronounce it. "Sakura, are you there?
I need your address, Sakura. Why won't you tell me where you live, Sakura? The most disturbing thing of all was that it didn't get tired. It didn't get frustrated. It didn't change tactics. It just kept repeating the same questions over and over with an infinite patience that wasn't human. I stayed completely silent, hoping that if I didn't respond, it would eventually give up and hang up. But it didn't. The call stayed connected, and the voice kept asking for my address every few seconds. What felt like hours passed, though it was probably only a few minutes. Then I remembered something. When I'd had problems with my iPhone before, sometimes I had to do a forced reset. It was something I'd learned when I jailbroke the phone the year before. You had to hold down the home button and the power button at the same time until the phone completely rebooted. It was a last resort for when the system froze. With my hands shaking, I pressed and held both buttons. At first, nothing happened. The voice kept talking, the phone kept working normally. But after about 10 seconds, the screen suddenly went black. The silence was immediate and absolute. The voice cut off in the middle of a word, like someone had unplugged a cable. My room went completely quiet, except for the sound of my own heart pounding. I sat there holding my powered-off phone for several minutes. My hands were sweaty and shaking slightly, like after a really bad scare. When I finally turned the phone back on, it worked perfectly normally. It responded to every touch. All the buttons worked. Every app opened without any issues. It was as if nothing had happened. I checked my call log, expecting to see the unknown number that had called me, but there was no record of the call. According to my phone, no one had called me that night. The last call in my history was from 3 days earlier. That disturbed me just as much as the call itself. It meant that whoever had called me had found a way to do it without leaving any trace, without any record on my phone at all. I also checked my text messages, my email, all my apps, looking for any sign that someone had accessed my accounts. Everything looked normal. There were no new messages, no signs that anyone had been in my accounts. But I knew something had happened. My phone freezing like that wasn't normal. The voice using my internet name wasn't normal. The way the call completely vanished from my history wasn't normal. Over the next few days, I kept expecting to receive a message, an email, another call. I thought maybe it was part of some elaborate scam and they would try to contact me again. But it never happened. I didn't receive any strange messages. No one else tried to call me from unknown numbers. There was no follow-up at all. It was as if whoever had called me had gotten what they wanted from that one conversation, even though I never gave my address. Or maybe they realized I was too alert, too suspicious, and decided to look for someone easier. But there's something that still bothers me to this day. During that call, when the voice asked me for my address, it felt like it already knew it, like it wasn't asking because it needed the information, but to confirm something it already knew. It felt like a test, to see if I would be honest, if I would cooperate, if I would be an easy victim. And when I refused to give my address, when I tried to hang up, when I started asking questions, maybe they decided I wasn't what they were looking for. I've changed my phone number since then, and I've changed all my internet usernames. I no longer use Sakura for anything. and I try to keep my internet accounts as separate as possible from my real personal information. But I still wonder how they got my number in the first place, how they connected my phone to my online accounts, how they managed to make my iPhone stop responding to my commands, and most importantly, I wonder what would have happened if I had given them my address. I wonder if there were other people who received similar calls, people who were less cautious than me, people who gave their information without asking questions.
Sometimes late at night, when I look at my phone before going to sleep, I remember that calm professional voice asking over and over again for my address, and I wonder if they're still out there, calling other people, asking the same questions, waiting to find someone naive enough to give them what they want. Because whatever they planned to do with that address, it wasn't anything good. And to this day, I don't know how close I came to finding that out in the worst possible way. Story 14. During the pandemic, when everyone was locked inside and slowly going crazy from the lack of human contact, my dad and I decided to take a motorcycle trip. I had my Triumph, he had his '73 Harley Panhead. We figured it would be perfect to get out on the road for a few days, keep our distance from other people, but still do something fun together. We decided to ride along the Blue Ridge Parkway and then head toward the Nantahala National Forest. It's a beautiful route, especially that time of year, with all the trees changing color and the cool mountain air. It was exactly what we needed after months stuck inside the house. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. It was one of those small, rustic campgrounds, not the big ones with showers and gift shops. This one had about 10 campsites, each with its own picnic table and fire pit. A small river ran nearby, and you could hear trains passing in the distance because railroad tracks cut through the forest. We set up our tents just as the sun was going down. My dad built a fire while I organized our gear, and by around 8 p.m., we were sitting by the fire eating sandwiches and drinking beer. It was perfect, exactly what we'd been craving for months. My dad went to bed around 10, but I wasn't tired yet. After being cooped up for so long, being outside in the forest, breathing fresh air and listening to the night sounds had me too stimulated to sleep. I kept the fire going for a while longer, but eventually it burned down to embers. It was a clear night with lots of stars and the moon was nearly full, so there was enough light to see the trees and the river. Around 11:30, my boyfriend texted me asking how the day had been. I decided to call him instead of texting because I wanted to tell him about the trip, and it was easier to talk than type on my phone. I walked a little away from the campsite so I wouldn't wake my dad. I went over near the train tracks where the signal was better and sat down on a fallen log about 20 meters from our tent. I was talking to my boyfriend, telling him about the ride and how beautiful the forest was, when I started to feel that strange sensation of being watched. At first, I ignored it. I was in the middle of the forest at night. It was normal to feel a little uneasy, but the feeling got stronger, like there were specific eyes focused on me, not just the general unease of being alone in nature. I kept talking on the phone, but I started looking around more often. The moonlight made everything look silver, and there was enough light to make out the shapes of trees and bushes around me. I was telling my boyfriend about the motorcycles we'd seen on the road when I noticed something moving among the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal. Forests are full of nocturnal wildlife, and it wouldn't have been strange to see a deer or a raccoon. But when I looked closely, I realized that whatever was moving had a human shape. There was a figure standing among the trees about 40 meters from where I was sitting. It was tall and extremely thin, like someone who was severely underweight or malnourished. Its arms and legs were far too long for its torso, as if the proportions were wrong. My first reaction was panic. I thought there was a stranger in the woods, maybe someone dangerous. But there was something about the way it moved, about the shape of its body, that didn't seem completely human. It moved too smoothly, too fluidly, like its joints worked differently than ours. And when it stopped moving, it became completely motionless in a way that also didn't seem natural. Humans never stand perfectly still. There are always tiny movements, shifts in weight, breathing. This figure was like a statue. I told my boyfriend I had to hang up, that there was something in the woods that was making me nervous. He asked if he wanted me to stay on the phone with me, but I told him it was probably nothing and that I'd call him later. I hung up and stayed sitting there, staring at the spot where I'd seen the figure. For a moment, I thought maybe it had left, that it was my imagination, or maybe just a tree that looked strange in the moonlight. Then I saw it move again, this time closer. Now it was about 25 meters away, and I could see more details. It definitely had a human shape, but something was very wrong. It was too tall, too thin, and it moved in a way that made my brain scream that this wasn't normal. I couldn't clearly see its face because of the distance and the light, but there was something about the way it held its head that sent chills through me. It was tilted to one side, like it was listening to something, or like its neck didn't work properly. My instincts were telling me to get up and run back to the campsite, but I was also afraid to make any sudden movements. It felt like encountering a wild animal. You don't know whether running will trigger a chase or whether staying still is safer. The figure took another step closer, and I could hear the sound of dry leaves crunching under its feet. But the sound was strange, softer than it should have been for something the size of a person, as if it didn't weigh as much as it should have. That was when I stood up. I couldn't stay there for another second. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there immediately. But instead of running straight back to the campsite, I moved slowly to the side, trying to keep distance between myself and the figure while heading toward the tent. I didn't want to turn my back on it completely, but I also didn't want to provoke it with sudden movements. The figure followed me with its gaze, or at least that's what it felt like. Even though I couldn't see its eyes, I knew it was watching every move I made. When I started to move away, it started moving too, but not directly toward me. It moved parallel, like it was trying to cut me off from the campsite. That was what convinced me it wasn't a confused animal or a lost person. It was something that understood tactics, something that was thinking strategically about how to position itself in relation to me. I changed direction, moving more directly toward the campsite, and the figure adjusted its path to match. It was like we were playing some kind of silent game, each of us trying to anticipate the other's movements. Eventually, I reached a spot where I was close enough to the campsite that I could run straight to my tent without having to weave around trees or bushes. That's when I decided to run. I ran as fast as I could toward my tent, and I heard sounds behind me as if the figure had started moving too. But they weren't normal steps. It was more like the sound of branches being pushed aside very quickly, like something moving through the forest in a completely different way than humans move.
I reached my tent and dove inside so fast I almost collapsed the whole thing. I zipped the entrance shut and sat there, breathing hard and listening. The sounds stopped as suddenly as they had started.
The forest fell completely silent, which was strange because there's usually a constant background of nighttime sounds, crickets, owls, small animals moving through the leaves. But for several minutes, there was absolutely nothing. It was the kind of silence you feel right before something bad happens, as if all the wildlife in the area had decided to hide at the exact same time. I stayed awake for hours, lying in my sleeping bag, but completely alert, listening for any sound that might indicate something approaching our campsite. Around 2 a.m., the normal sounds of the forest gradually returned. Crickets, the wind moving through the trees, the sound of the river flowing. It was as if whatever had been there had left, and the wildlife finally felt safe enough to return to normal. The next morning, I didn't tell my dad what had happened. I didn't want to ruin the trip, and I wasn't sure how to explain what I'd seen without sounding completely crazy. But during breakfast, my dad mentioned that he had heard strange noises during the night. He said it sounded like someone or something moving around the perimeter of our campsite. But when he looked through the mesh window of his tent, he hadn't seen anything. He also mentioned that it had been an unusually quiet night, like all the animals had gone somewhere else. After breakfast, I decided to walk around the area where I'd seen the figure to see if I could find any evidence of what had happened. Footprints, broken branches, anything that would confirm it hadn't just been my imagination. I found the log where I'd been sitting and was able to roughly trace the path I'd taken when I ran back to the campsite. But in the area where I'd seen the figure, I couldn't find any clear sign that something had been there. There were a few broken branches, but they could have been caused by normal animals or by the wind. There were some marks in the dirt that might have been footprints, but they were too indistinct to be sure what had made them. The only thing I found that felt definitely strange was a patch of ground where the leaves had been flattened in a circular pattern, as if something large had been standing there for a long time, shifting its weight from one foot to the other. Even that could have had a normal explanation. Maybe a deer had been feeding there, or some other animal had used the spot as a lookout. We drove home that same day, and during the entire ride back, I couldn't get the image of that tall, thin figure moving through the trees out of my head. The way it had moved, so fluid yet so unnatural, stayed with me for weeks. I've camped in forests my entire life, and I'd never had an experience like that. I've seen bears, I've seen strange people, I've had frightening encounters with wildlife, but I'd never seen something my brain simply couldn't categorize as normal. What disturbed me the most was the intelligence it had shown, the way it tried to position itself between me and the campsite, how it responded to my movements with movements of its own. That wasn't the behavior of a confused animal or a lost person. It felt like something that was hunting, using tactics and strategy, like it had done this before. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night in the woods, but I know it wasn't completely human, and it wasn't any animal I recognized. It was something that existed in the space between things, something that only comes out when there aren't enough people around to keep it hidden. And every time I go camping now, I can't help but wonder if there's something out there, standing just outside the circle of light from my campfire, watching me with that inhuman patience, waiting for the perfect moment to step a little closer. Story 15.
I was sleeping at my boyfriend's house that night, in the room he shared with his grandmother. It was a small house, one of those old constructions where the rooms are divided strangely and you sleep wherever there's space. His grandmother had her bed on one side of the room, and we had a mattress on the floor on the other side. The room had an odd, elongated shape, with a dark hallway leading towards the rest of the house. During the day, it didn't look threatening, but at night, that hallway turned into a tunnel of complete darkness that made me nervous every time I had to get up to use the bathroom. That night, I fell asleep without any trouble. My boyfriend's grandmother snored softly in her bed, and the familiar sound of her breathing helped me relax. My boyfriend was sleeping deeply beside me, and everything felt normal and safe. I don't know exactly what woke me. It wasn't a specific noise, but rather that feeling you get when something in the environment changes, when your brain realizes that something isn't the same as it was when you fell asleep. It was around 2 or 3 in the morning, that hour when everything is submerged in a bluish twilight that still lets you make out the shapes of furniture. I slowly opened my eyes and looked around the room. At first, everything seemed normal. The grandmother was still asleep in her bed. My boyfriend was still motionless beside me. The familiar shadows of the furniture were where they always were. But when I looked towards the foot of the grandmother's bed, I saw something that made me feel as if ice had been injected directly into my veins. There was a figure standing there, a tall figure, completely black, like the silhouette of a man wearing a long coat or trench coat. It was solid, three-dimensional, but entirely dark, as if it were made of absolute blackness. The figure was completely motionless, standing directly at the foot of the grandmother's bed, as if it were watching her sleep. I couldn't see facial features or details, just that perfect human shape outlined against the dim light of the room. My first instinct was to squeeze my eyes shut and open them again, thinking I was seeing things because I was half asleep. But when I opened them again, the figure was still there, in exactly the same position. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it might wake everyone in the house. At the same time, I was terrified to make any movement at all, to draw my attention to myself. It felt like I instinctively knew that if that thing realized I was awake, something bad would happen. The figure didn't move at all. It was like a statue, but there was something about its presence that was definitely alive, definitely aware. Even though I couldn't see eyes, I knew it was watching, that it was there for a specific purpose. I thought about waking my boyfriend. He was right next to me. I could have gently touched him to get his attention without making noise, but I was terrified to make any part of my body. It was as if some primitive part of my brain was screaming that my only chance of survival was to remain completely still. I was tempted to slowly move my leg closer to his to make contact and wake him without sudden movement. My leg was only about 5 centimeters from his. It would have been the smallest movement, but I couldn't do it. Fear had completely paralyzed me. As I lay there trying to decide what to do, I began to notice more details about the figure. It was definitely tall, probably taller than any normal person. The coat or trench coat it seemed to be wearing reached almost to the floor, and its arms hung motionless at its sides. But the most disturbing thing was the way it was standing. It wasn't casual or relaxed. It was standing at attention, like a guard or a sentry, as if it were carrying out a specific duty. And it was looking directly at the grandmother.
It wasn't looking at my boyfriend or me, not at the window, not at the door, specifically at the bed where the grandmother was sleeping. as if she were the reason it was there. The minutes passed like hours as I lay there, watching that motionless figure. My boyfriend continued to sleep soundly, his breathing steady and calm. The grandmother was also still asleep, but now her snores sounded slightly different, heavier, a bit more labored. I closed my eyes several times, hoping that when I opened them again, the figure would be gone. But each time I looked, it was still there, in exactly the same position, as if it were a permanent part of the room. After what felt like hours, but were probably just minutes, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't lie there all night, paralyzed by fear. Very slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, I began to turn my head toward my boyfriend. But the moment I started to move, it felt as though the figure's attention had shifted to me. Even though I still couldn't see a face or eyes, I knew with absolute certainty that it was now staring directly at me. That feeling of being watched was so intense it felt almost physical, as if invisible beams connected my eyes to its own. My body tensed automatically and I froze completely. We stayed like that for several more minutes in a kind of silent standoff, me lying on the floor trying to control my breathing so it wouldn't be obvious, and that figure standing at the foot of the bed, now definitely aware that I was awake. The air in the room felt heavier, denser, as if the presence of that thing had physically altered the atmosphere. Breathing became more difficult, like there was less oxygen available. And then, so gradually at first that I wasn't sure it was happening, the figure began to fade. It didn't move, it didn't walk anywhere, it didn't turn to leave. It simply became less solid, less defined, like black smoke slowly dispersing into the air. The process took several minutes, and during that time I kept my eyes fixed on it, both fascinated and terrified at once. When it finally disappeared completely, the air in the room immediately felt lighter. I could breathe deeply again, and the oppressive feeling that had been present since I first saw the figure dissipated along with it. But I didn't relax immediately. I stayed lying there, completely alert, expecting it to reappear. I had a gut feeling that maybe this was part of some pattern, that perhaps it appeared and disappeared multiple times throughout the night. After about half an hour with nothing else happening, I finally began to feel sleepy again. It's that strange exhaustion you feel after a very intense scare, like your body has burned all its adrenaline at once. I fell asleep without realizing it and woke up the next morning feeling like I hadn't slept at all. I had that deep, heavy fatigue you feel after a very restless night, even though I had technically slept enough hours. During breakfast, my boyfriend's mother mentioned that the grandmother hadn't felt well during the night. She had trouble breathing and had decided to take her to the hospital in the morning to get checked. When I heard that, my blood ran cold. I remembered how the figure had been standing specifically at the foot of the grandmother's bed, watching her sleep. I remembered how her snores sounded different while that thing was in the room. I didn't say anything about what I had seen. How could I explain that I saw a black figure standing at her bedside? It would have sounded completely insane, and I had no idea if there was any real connection between the apparition and the grandmother's health, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure hadn't been there by coincidence. There was something about the way it had been positioned, the way it had been observing the grandmother, that made me feel like it had been there for a specific reason. During the day, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it had been a hallucination caused by being in an unfamiliar place. Maybe it had been a combination of shadows and dim light creating the illusion of a human figure. Maybe my half-asleep mind had misinterpreted something completely normal. But it had been too solid, too defined, too present to be just an illusion, and it had lasted too long to be a mere trick of the light. That night, when it was time to sleep again, I refused to stay in the same room. I told my boyfriend I didn't feel well, that I preferred to go home and sleep in my own bed. He offered to come with me, but I said it was not necessary. Over the following weeks, whenever he mentioned his grandmother, I paid close attention. Her health continued to gradually decline. It wasn't sudden or dramatic, but it was as if something had changed that night, as if some invisible line had been crossed. I never stayed overnight in that house again when I knew I would have to share a room with the grandmother. I always found some excuse to go home or to have her stay at my place instead. My boyfriend never fully understood why I had changed my attitude towards sleeping there. I tried to tell him the house made me nervous at night, but I couldn't reveal the whole truth without sounding like I was losing my mind. To this day, I'm not entirely sure what I saw that night, but I do know it wasn't my imagination, and I know there was a connection between that figure and what happened to the grandmother afterwards. It was as if it had been a visitor, someone who had come to assess the situation, to determine if the time was right for something, like a messenger or a precursor for something that was about to happen. And the most terrifying part is that I will never know if my presence that night changed anything, whether the fact that I was awake and watching interfered in some way with what that thing had come to do, or whether my silence, my decision not to wake anyone up, allowed it to complete its purpose without interruption. Because even though the figure disappeared without doing anything visible, I have the horrible feeling that it did something that altered the course of events in a way I will never fully understand, but which I witnessed in those terrible minutes, face to face with something that shouldn't exist in our world.